can hear me well. My name is Boris Janjala, and I'm a corporate governance officer of IFC ECA ESG Advisory Program that is implemented with support of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. First of all, I would like to make sure that everybody is comfortable to use translation function in Zoom. All of you should have the interpretation button, which allows you to choose the appropriate language channel if you don't understand the language spoken on the so-called ground floor channel. For those who can speak both Ukrainian and English, I think it will be convenient to stay on this ground floor channel. For those who choose the option of translation, once the translation is not needed anymore, then you can click and return to the initial channel. You might also wish to ask questions in the chat, and please do so. Do this either in English or Russian. And also, I want to let you know that we are recording this session, and also we have a kind request. Those who will not be speaking, please mute yourself. This will allow us to have a good quality connection for the entire workshop. Thank you very much, and I will open now this workshop. This webinar is organized jointly by the Ukraine National Securities and Stock Market Commission, International Finance Corporation, and its environmental social governance program in Europe and Central Asia, and also United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative. This workshop aims to help companies in Ukraine to understand how to report better to investors and other key stakeholders, including and building on IFC tools such as award-winning Disclosure and Transparency Toolkit, Beyond the Balance Sheet, IFC Financial Institutional Group materials, and also United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative resources. Objective of this webinar are to demonstrate strategic value and demand for corporate reporting and disclosure practices, provide practical guidance, tools, and resources for integrating financial and ESG reporting practices in emerging markets, and develop and support capacity building resources, networks, and partnerships in Ukraine. I will kindly ask Timur Khromayev, Chair of the National Securities and Stock Market Commission, Jason Brett Pelmer, IFC Regional Manager for Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, and Viktor Shutkevich, Assistant Director, Embassy of Switzerland in Ukraine, to open the event and greet the participants. First, I will pass the floor to Timur. Timur, please.
Yes, Boris, thank you very much for introduction. Unfortunately, I'll stay without the picture, so you won't see my good-looking face, because I just got out of the meeting, but was very eager to participate in this call. We obviously very much appreciate it to IFC for opportunity to work together in developing Ukrainian ESG disclosure framework and the toolkit, because we believe that coherent reporting that can allow companies, regulators, society, investors to understand the impact of the business activities that their issuers are engaged in would serve an enormous purpose and value for investors. And the Commission is very much interested in making sure that this toolkit becomes a regulatory guidance that would serve our businesses in their investment world. So thank you very much, and looking forward so that you would really look and value this workshop for yourself. Thanks a lot.
Timur, thank you very much. We are really grateful to have such a committed partner as National Securities and Stock Market Commission, and we look forward to the next steps of our cooperation. And I'm pleased to pass the floor to Jason Brett Pelmer, IFC Regional Manager for Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. Dear Jason, please.
Thanks, Boris, and thanks to Timur. And maybe just to start by echoing that sentiment, Boris, I mean, all of this work couldn't be possible without Timur's leadership and the Commission as an institution. So allow me to welcome you. It is a great pleasure for me, for us to gather and launch this webinar. I think it's an opportunity to take stock of the progress of our partnership with the National Securities and Stock Market Commission of Ukraine. I also want to thank the government of Switzerland and SECO for their continued support of IFC and the Environmental and Social Governance ESG Advisory Program. As Victor said, I mean, we're seeing each other more and more often on a number of exciting initiatives. And also, as mentioned, the work with the Commission. I also want to thank the government of Austria, who is backing IFC's Green Finance Program, where together with the Commission, we are introducing green finance standards. And these two programs complement each other in developing sustainable finance in Ukraine. Our collaboration with the Commission aims to support the sustainable economic development of the country. As a leading development financial institution, IFC is witnessing a growing trend among investors to pay more attention to the way companies manage disclosure and transparency issues. This is because when transparency and ESG data is integrated with strategic and financial reporting, firms can access cheaper capital, encouraging new investments, boosting economic growth, and generating new jobs. Therefore, IFC is working with Ukraine's private sector to attract and retain investment by promoting best-in-class financial and non-financial reporting. This is important because in addition to helping achieve our development goals, reducing poverty and increasing shared prosperity, it's also critical to IFC as an investor and as a lender. Quality non-financial reporting presents opportunities to manage commercial and reputational risk, add value to clients, and contribute to the development of public and private capital markets. Improved disclosure is directly correlated with lower cost of capital, better access to finance, and increased company valuation. While today's general practice is to disclose financial statements, we're seeing greater voluntary adoption of good corporate governance and environmental and social reporting practices by many local companies and IFC clients. Integrated ESG reporting can help external stakeholders and investors assess where a company is making a positive contribution to society. This is a factor that's increasingly important with the rise of impact investing. To support Ukraine's private sector in this area, in partnership with Switzerland, IFC worked with the Commission and the Ukraine Corporate Governance Academy to develop Ukraine's corporate governance code. The code is set to become a guide for listed and unlisted companies in adopting corporate governance standards, including sustainability. The code recommends that Ukrainian companies disclose non-financial information, such as environmental, social, and governance matters. IFC will work with the Commission on developing an ESG scorecard to monitor implementation of the code and ESG disclosure guidelines to ensure effective and flexible disclosure of non-financial information. COVID-19 has prompted the most severe market crash since the global financial crisis. But I wouldn't call it a silver lining, but what gives us some comfort is that those firms who focused on ESG issues did better than those who did not. According to BlackRock data, 88% of sustainable funds in their analysis outperformed their non-sustainable counterparts in the period January through end April 2020. Good ESG practices and disclosure will remain a key component for investors in their decision-making. We can't underestimate the importance of this event and the need for effective engagement and cooperation of all stakeholders to promote sound ESG practices in Ukraine. So again, let me thank all of you and our partners and those who have joined this webinar, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thanks.
Many thanks, Jason. Indeed, this new reality underscores the importance of sound ESG practices, and I think this event is very timely. Thanks so much. Now I'm glad to pass the floor to Viktor Shutkevich, Assistant Director, Embassy of Switzerland in Ukraine. Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, kindly supports activities of the IFC ECA ESG Advisory Program, including today's event. Dear Viktor, over to you.
Thank you, Boris. Good morning. Good morning on behalf of the Embassy of Switzerland in Ukraine, on behalf of SECO, which is basically Swiss Ministry for Economic Affairs. And this ministry supports many projects in the economic development area. And I'm in charge of our economic portfolio within the Embassy of Switzerland in Ukraine. Our greetings to the National Commission, to Timur Kharmayev, our greetings to the IFC team, Jason and all the team and all participants of this event. Switzerland is present in Ukraine for the last 20 years with providing technical support, and we are basically number 5 donor in Ukraine with the volume of provided technical support, but we're also number 10 investor to Ukraine, and we have quite a number of Swiss companies in Ukraine. It motivates us to look into different areas, but definitely corporate governance. This is the area where we started cooperation with IFC a long time ago and succeeded a lot, basically, in introducing corporate governance court, in introducing boards in different institutions. That story was a success and inspired us now to jump together into more sophisticated area as ESG. Yeah, it's a challenging, but we see that dedication of the National Commission, and basically due to some reasons, we didn't manage to join your official ceremony on signing the partnership. And again, we welcome that partnership between IFC and the National Commission. Congratulations. And it's really a pleasure to have such a strong state partner, but also a pleasure to have such a strong implementing partner as IFC for us. We do ask, I will be frank, we do ask this year internally, but also with our colleagues in Switzerland, we do ask the question, how relevant ESG during this year? And our conclusion, and I would like to support Jason, that COVID being a challenge brings us the importance of ESG even higher, because it creates new opportunities for Ukrainian SMEs, new opportunities for Ukrainian financial institutions. So we see really a great open window now, and still a long journey ahead of us. And we will stay with you along this journey. And again, congratulations on this important partnership, and we wish you a fruitful day today. Thank you. Back to you, Boris.
Thank you, Viktor. Once again, many thanks for your support, and we can always feel that, and I'm certain, confident we will have even more achievements and results in terms of promotion of good ESG practices in Ukraine. Dear gentlemen, Timur, Jason, Viktor, once again, many thanks for opening this event. Dear colleagues, I would also like to thank our partners, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, which is a network of 104 stock exchanges and regulators, for co-organizing today's webinar. And we have Anthony Miller, who will be one of our speakers at this event. With your permission, I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Ralica Germanova, to moderate the panel on the business case for transparency that aims to discuss the importance of ESG transparency and also the challenges in disclosing ESG information. Let me briefly introduce Ralica. Ralica is a part of IFC Corporate Governance Group team. She works with regulators, partner institutions, and private sector companies to improve corporate governance practices across the world, in Europe, Central Asia, Africa, Middle East, and East Asia. Ralitza is leading the practice group on codes, standards, and ESG disclosure and transparency, and works on development of knowledge tools and solutions in these areas. Ralitza is one of the principal authors of corporate governance scorecards toolkits, and also IFC Disclosure and Transparency Toolkit. She also supported development of over 20 corporate governance codes and scorecards across the world. So Rali, over to you.
Thank you, Boris. Good morning, everyone. It's great to virtually meet you. And regards, I'm normally based in Washington, D.C., but the last few months I'm working from my home country, Bulgaria. So I'm very close. So why is transparency and disclosure of environmental, social, and governance issues important when everyone is focused on financial sustainability? And how can companies attract capital and build resilient enterprises in times of crisis? How to build trust in investors and stakeholders that companies are managing risks and creating opportunities in the new environment. For most businesses around the world, this is their first encounter with a global pandemic, and there is no playbook on how to respond. After managing the initial impacts, companies now must quickly turn their attention to longer-term measures to operate in a new normal, which requires shifting strategies and new approaches to business models and operations to remain viable. Therefore, it's more important now than ever for businesses to actively communicate changes to strategies and practices with investors and other stakeholders, such as regulators, customers, employees, and the communities in which they operate. Disclosure and transparency are critical to building trust and confidence as companies demonstrate how they're mitigating risks and pursuing business opportunities in response to crisis. Even before the emergence of COVID, sustainable investing has jumped in popularity as investors place an increasing focus on how environmental, social, and governance factors affect returns. Globally, more and more regulators are taking steps to encourage sustainable finance and strengthen ESG reporting. This session will provide an overview of the strategic value, demand, and challenges of ESG disclosure and practical tools how to respond to them. We have an exciting panel for you who will present diverse perspectives from the lens of regulators and stock exchanges, green bonds and sustainable finance, European Union and global developments, and IFC approach to ESG disclosure. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to present and 7 minutes to answer questions. Please use the chat box to pose your questions. So we are starting with our co-host today from the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, Anthony Miller, on the regulatory and stock exchanges perspective. Anthony is the coordinator of our partner, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, and the focal point for corporate social responsibility within UNCTAD, the Investment and Enterprise Division of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He has managed the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative since its launch by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2009. And this initiative has been named by Forbes magazine as one of the world's best sustainable ideas. So Anthony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ralitza. Let me just share my screen. That working?
Yes.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be with everyone today, and I'd like to start by thanking the Ukraine National Securities and Stock Exchanges Commission for co-hosting this event with the IFC and the UNSSE, and of course our great thanks to all our partners at the IFC who did most of the heavy lifting and organizing this event, and I think did a great job. And we're very pleased to have a strategic partnership with the IFC, conducting technical assistance and capacity building with stock exchanges and their market constituents around the world. I'm happy to be with you today talking in this first panel about the business case for transparency. Before I get into the practices of stock exchanges and security market regulators in this area, I wanted to talk a little bit about the broader context, about what is shifting interest in ESG factors, and that's what's underpinning, of course, interest in ESG disclosure. So let me start with the broad global policy environment. As many of you will know, in 2015, the United Nations member states agreed on a set of 17 goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we are attempting to achieve by the year 2030. We're still 10 years away, which is a long period of time. Let's remember the space race itself lasted only about 10 years. And at the time that they started, they had very little technology to do anything. And they managed to get to the moon and the back with computers that were probably far, far insufficient to what you have in your phone today. So it was a dramatic period, and it shows what humanity can do in 10 years when they put their minds to it. And member states around the world are focused on achieving these sustainable development goals. And these sustainable development goals are having an impact on the way investment patterns are being shaped. You see this already in the energy sector, where traditionally, if we think about the way we conceive of the world and the way it develops, we are all aware that there are certain technologies that are the traditional ways of doing things. And we can imagine in the future, at some distant point in the future, we might change to cleaner technologies and do things in a more sustainable way. I think the key thing to take away here is that that distant future is now happening today. This is the world we live in right now, and it is being shaped by this global policy environment around the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement around climate change in particular, which is, of course, an urgent demand for all of the world and the markets to transition to low carbon economies. So this is happening right now, and it is very much leading to changing investment patterns. In individual industries, we are seeing dramatic disruption for those industries that are able to adapt to this new environment and those industries that are not able to adapt to this new environment. Again, this is critical. I'd like to ask investors and even issuers on the call today to think about, put yourself in the year 1990 or 1995, and imagine yourself being in the photographic film industry, say you're Kodak or Fujifilm, and you think that this is just a fantastic industry. It makes enormous amounts of money. It's been around for half a century plus, and there's no end in sight. Everybody loves pictures. It will never end. You know, of course, within 5 years, the entire industry is completely wiped out by digital photography. Disruption's a real thing. It can happen very quickly. And what we're looking at now during this decade of delivery on the Sustainable Development Goals, we're going to see an increasing ramping up of public policy responses geared towards sustainability. As this happens, it will disrupt certain industries. Some industries will be fit for purpose to go into the 21st century of sustainable business. Other industries will need to adapt heavily. And this is what investors are interested in when they're thinking about ESG disclosure. Are you one of those industries? Are you one of those companies that is going to pass this great filter into the 21st century of sustainable business practices? Or are you not? Are you going to be disrupted by other players in the industry, or are you going to succeed? So these are some of the key elements here that are driving market interest in improved sustainability reporting and integration of environmental, social, and governance factors into market products and mainstream disclosure practices. So let me talk a little bit about what stock exchanges are doing in this space. This is a long-term trend of the last 20 years of what stock exchanges are doing. And these are a number of the factors that we track on the SSE's database. You can look up any of these factors in our database online. So what you'll see is that there's an enormous surge in stock exchanges providing guidance for sustainability reporting. There's an enormous surge in training activities that stock exchanges are trying to help their issuers and their investors adapt to this new environment. And all across the board, there is a clear trend line. I'd like to focus in on just a couple of things particularly relevant for this call today. And that is the trend line on exchanges with guidance on ESG disclosure and exchanges with mandatory ESG disclosure listing requirements. And what we're seeing here, if you look particularly at the line on guidance on ESG disclosure, again, if you go back to about 2015, there were only about 14 exchanges in the world that had any kind of guidance on ESG disclosure. At that time, the SSE launched a global campaign to encourage exchanges to introduce guidance, and you'll see that the trend line goes nearly vertical thereafter. We are now at a point where more than half of the world's major exchanges have got guidance on ESG disclosure, and this has clearly become a defined mainstream market expectation. Markets expect companies to deliver reporting on the sustainability factors and how they are adapting to this new global policy environment on sustainable development. And investors are valuing that transition. Just in the same way if an investor knew ahead of time what was going to happen to Kodak, they would value the companies that are going to be able to pass through a disruptive period. And make no mistake, this will be a disruptive period. It's important that every industry try to adapt and ensure that their business practices are going to contribute to the sustainable future that everybody is working towards. The other key line here I'd like to focus on this lower line about mandatory disclosure listing requirements. One of the Sustainable Development Goals, 12.6, revolves around ESG disclosure and the objective that all companies around the world all have integrated ESG disclosure into their reporting practices. What we've seen is a tremendous leap forward in mandatory reporting. So if you go back 10 years ago, there were less than 5 markets in the world that were covered by any mandatory ESG disclosure rules. Now we're up to 24, and there's been a huge leap just in the last few years. On current trends, we can easily imagine that by the end of this decade, ESG disclosure will be mandatory in most markets around the world. This is important because when it comes to disclosure practices, it's difficult to go from 0 to 100 with nothing in between. Integrating ESG into your operations is a journey, and you need to start that journey somewhere and work your way forward. So if you can see the future coming, that in a few years' time, you may be subjected to mandatory ESG disclosure requirements, then you should start now on that learning journey through voluntary guidance that you can adapt and integrate into your business practices so that you are already up to speed and up to best practice by the time that this becomes integrated into your own regulatory requirements. So these are the current trend lines, and these are the reactions taking place. I'd just like to conclude, Relitsa, with a couple of takeaway messages. As I mentioned before, this new 21st century policy environment, the sustainability factors are increasingly material. Investors know this. Investors are always putting a price on a company based on future returns, not on what happened today or yesterday. So they're looking to know how your company is integrating ESG factors. Stock exchanges and policy makers recognize what's happening, this grand shift in the policy environment around investing in sustainable business practices. And they've been increasingly making efforts to assist companies in improving their reporting practices and helping investors also to integrate ESG factors into their analysis of business and to better understand ESG reporting. Issuers, of course, recognize this, and you see across the board, large companies are constantly upgrading their sustainability reporting practices, and this has now become a mainstream expectation of large listed companies around the world. So of course, particularly for companies that are looking for foreign investors who have become accustomed to these kind of reporting practices, this is now what is expected. I want to emphasize here that when we talk about ESG disclosure, it's important to realize that you cannot just have ESG disclosure without also having ESG business practices. So I intentionally talk about integrating ESG factors into both disclosure and the actual business practices, because you do have to report on something. You can, of course, have the phenomenon of having an excellent report that just reports about a lot of bad things. You can imagine the comparison in the financial world would be having a nice, well done financial report that just reports that your company is going bankrupt. So having good reporting is part of the equation, but actually having something good to report is one of the key things. So you need to focus on both aspects of this, and they do have they are interrelated, of course, insofar as what you report is what you manage, and what you manage you can then report your progress on. So I just want to emphasize that whenever you're talking about ESG reporting, that cannot be divorced or isolated from the actual way the company is being run. The final thing I want to say, Relisa, before I stop, is just to say that we all need to update our mental maps for the road ahead. Many of us, if you've ever driven in a car that has a GPS system that's kind of out of date, and you come to an intersection that somehow your car does not recognize at all because the intersection maybe is new, or there's a new light or something like this, then you know that phenomenon of having an out-of-date map. And many times when we think about the world, we are navigating the world based on our mental map that we have in our head. And that mental map needs to occasionally be updated. Many of us are walking around with a mental map, picture of the world the way the world was 20 some years ago. But the world is not like that anymore. The world is changing very rapidly. And the 21st century world, and particularly over this next decade of delivery for the Sustainable Development Goals, is focused on sustainable business practices. And to be a company fit for purpose in the 21st century, it's very important to focus on these environmental, social, and governance factors. Relisa, with that, I'm happy to stop and, of course, take any questions.
Thank you, Anthony, for a great presentation and even greater key takeaways that are putting our discussion and shaping our discussion today. If anybody has any questions, feel free to either post them via the chat box or unmute yourself and ask them. And thank you so much for underlying the importance of the connection between business practices and annual reports, because your report is as good as your practices. It's a reflection of what the company is doing, and as well as the disruption. Every company these days is quickly becoming like a digital company, delivering new services and adapting their products and services to the new world. We'll continue taking questions maybe when we go along. So with that, we'll there's a question on what is the difference between the responses of regulators versus the response of stock exchanges to the new ESG concerns?
Right. Thank you for that question, Richard. I think one of the key things, and this is can be a misunderstanding for some people, is that stock exchanges have different types of authorities in different markets. In some markets, stock exchanges can have a high degree of devolved regulatory powers insofar as they can set their own listing rules. In those markets, of course, the stock exchanges are often taking the lead in terms of mandatory listing rules and these types of things. In many other markets, stock exchanges have no control over listing rules at all, and everything's in the hand of the regulators, in which case the security market regulators are taking the lead on that. In every market, stock exchanges do have a high degree of what we could call soft power, and that is in the form of voluntary guidance documents on sustainability reporting and training. All stock exchanges have a mandate to do market education, and they already do tremendous amounts of market education for traditional aspects of the way the market operates, including financial reporting developments. So many of these exchanges have now integrated ESG reporting and disclosure practices into their market education programs. And that's one of the most widespread activities of stock exchanges in this area. The other thing I would say also about this difference between regulators versus stock exchanges is that, of course, if you're not working in a regulatory environment, stock exchanges can be a little bit more nimble and work a little bit faster, particularly if you're talking about introducing new training activities or voluntary guidelines. Regulators, of course, will have much more of a deliberative process to arrive. But we have been impressed at the number of regulatory regimes in the world that have developed over the last 5 years. As I mentioned earlier, they've really shot up. And we've seen progress at the international level at IOSCO. It's the International Organization of Security Commissions that launched just about 2 years ago. They launched their sustainability network, and now they've upgraded that in the past year to a board committee, and they seem to be making progress on this front going forward. So we can imagine in the next couple of years, they do have rather deliberative processes, but in the next couple of years, we can imagine them issuing guidance to security market regulators in their membership on this topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. And now we are going to move to another area where we have seen a lot of developments in the last few years, and this is the green bonds markets and the importance of ESG disclosure. And my colleague Roman Novikov will be presenting. Roman is from the IFC's Financial Institutions Group. He's heading the Ukraine Green Finance Program. And he's been with IFC since 2010, and prior to IFC, he worked in the banking sector, including Citibank, UniCredit Bank, and ProCredit Bank, and in the management of a large agro-industrial holdings. Roman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marisa. I will switch to local language while I will show my screen in English. Let me just a second. So can you see my slide?
Yes, Roman.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Добрий день, шановні учасники нашого заходу. Дуже вдячний за вашу увагу до цієї теми, оскільки це дійсно цікаве і нові тренди, які ми будемо раді, зокрема, просувати в Україні, тому що вони якби сприяють залученню інвестицій. І ми, зокрема, хотіли поговорити це в контексті нашої співпраці з комісією відносно розвитку ринків капіталів і чому ми говоримо, зокрема, про ESG Disclosure в цьому контексті. Власне, я трошки скажу про зелені облігації. Це ринок, який досить активно розвивається останні роки глобально і досить інтенсивно. Він зростає в рази. І ми вважаємо, що зараз дуже вдалий момент, і ми дякуємо комісії за такі, скажімо, реакцію і готовність співпрацювати над цим, щоб Україна використала ці, скажімо, тренди і так само долучилася до цього глобально, так само враховуючи ті зміни, які відбуваються в Європейському Союзі, враховуючи нашу угоду про асоціацію. Тому з цієї точки зору ми вважаємо, що це дуже важливий вклад тут саме залучення інвесторів, розширення співпраці фінансових установ, великих агрохолдингів та інших компаній щодо залучення інвестицій. Але разом з тим, говорячи про зелені облігації, зелені інвестиції, ми розуміємо, що мова йде про фінансування проєктів, які так чи інакше впливають на клімат, на навколишнє середовище, таке інше. Тому з цієї точки зору якість цих інвестицій, їх, скажімо так, відповідність вимогам інвесторів, вона повинна бути високою, щоб мати відповідну репутацію для країни і таке інше. І тому з цієї точки зору дуже важливим є от саме цей компонент. Є компоненти стандарти зелених, наприклад, облігацій, але є стандарти також ESG. І з цієї точки зору я хотів поговорити трохи більше про сам кейс, чому це важливо, чому це не просто, скажімо так, публічність, це також серйозний бізнес-кейс. І от на цьому слайді, який ви зараз бачите, ми так резюмували основні моменти, які стосуються цієї теми, чому, скажімо, інвесторів це повинно цікавити, чому це повинно бути цікавим для банків, чому це повинно бути важливим для, наприклад, позичальників банків і такі інших. І ви бачите, що, скажімо, це стосується досить широкого спектру різних проблем. І насправді вже і в Україні ми це бачимо, да, що ці питання, вони можуть серйозно вплинути на бізнес, не тільки на якість проєктів. І тому з точки зору інвесторів їм важливо бути впевненими, що їхні інвестиції відповідно відповідають найкращим вимогам ESG. І з цієї точки зору, відповідно, впровадження цих стандартів дуже важливі саме для інвесторів, які вкладаються в такі бумаги, наприклад, як зелені облігації, чи, наприклад, це можуть бути як публічні, звичайно, як це відбувається на західних ринках, але навіть для індивідуальних інвестиційних угод, наприклад, з IFC, з EBRD і другими міжнародними фінансовими установами, яких багато вже, для яких це питання є важливими, дотримання цих врахування цих, скажімо, створення відповідних систем, які дозволяють вам управляти цими ризиками, це дуже серйозний фактор при прийнятті рішення. І, власне, з цієї точки зору ми вважаємо, що ENS, Environmental Social Governance від самого високого рівня, наблюдатель спостережної ради, керівництва, впровадження в операційну практику, це все є дуже важливим і актуальним. І ми вдячні комісії, зокрема, за те, що серед наших перших кроків ми ESG – це одна із пілар цієї роботи. І ми сподіваємося, що впровадження з одного боку стандартів зелених облігацій, наприклад, а з іншого боку впровадження стандартів ESG, їх найкращої практики, воно якраз створить умови для того, щоб дійсно інвестори, такі як міжнародні фінансові інститути, інші, вони були впевнені, що їхні інвестиції в цьому сегменті вони будуть зроблені на найкращому рівні. І ми дуже вітаємо, скажімо, будь-які перші пілотні кроки, готові підтримувати їх як в частині безпосередньо випуску зелених облігацій, так і зокрема в частині впровадження цих кращих практик, які забезпечують якісні зелені інвестиції. Що важливо ще зауважити, що насправді це, як уже попередній доповідач сказав, практика вже досить серйозно в цьому відношенні розвинута, тому в цьому відношенні є можливість використовувати вже якісь хороші бенчмарки, є можливість використовувати, скажімо так, якісь уроки, практики і таке інше. Тому з одного боку це нова тенденція, з іншого боку вже є можливості, які можна використовувати і зекономити власний час, щоб це ефективно впровадити. Тому, знову ж таки, ми сподіваємося, що цей захід сьогоднішній, він посприяє цьому. І разом з тим, скажімо, наша співпраця з комісією дозволить, зрештою, в Україні встановити цей необхідний фреймворк, який дозволить в повноцінній мірі впровадити ринок зеленого фінансування, зокрема зелених облігацій. Thank you, Ralitsa. I think I have contributed to the main part and ready to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roman. If there are any questions now or later, please feel free to pose them via the chat box. Maybe we'll give people a few minutes, and then we can move to the next part of the presentation. Okay, well, we'll continue, Roman. Thank you. We'll continue collecting the questions, and I'll pose them as they come along. If you have any final words, now you're welcome to say. Otherwise, we'll move to Professor Boeva.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Professor Boeva is a member of the IFC Private Sector Advisory Group and professor at the University for National and World Economic Studies in Bulgaria, and she served as the commissioner of the Bulgarian National Securities and Stock Exchange Commission. She has been a member of the European Forum for Corporate Governance established by the European Commission, chairperson for the supervisory boards of the Privatization Fund Kaliman, and held board directorships in Bulgarian companies, among other things. And she will share with us today about the European Union and some global perspectives of transparency. Professor Boeva, the floor is yours. Maybe until Professor Boeva
There's a question, Raleigh.
join us. Exactly, that was my...
Yeah, I will translate it. So the question is, please tell us what's the essence of green bonds? What is the difference between green bonds and other kind of bonds, regular bonds? So Roman, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Then I will probably, if possible, I will then open a couple of slides, Raleigh, if you don't mind, because I see already some slides.
Yes, please go ahead.
Second. Just a second. Share screen.
And Roman, if you can't see the chat window, there is another question. What preferences do green bond issuers receive? So please also elaborate a bit on that.
Yes.
Thank you.
So you can see my screen, yes, at the moment?
Yes, Roman.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Шановні учасники, дуже дякую за питання. Доречне і дійсно в контексті, от що ми теми, яку ми обговорюємо, це важливо проговорити. Тоді, можливо, краще буде зрозуміло, чому ми і про цю тему ESG Disclosure, власне, говоримо. І якщо ми говоримо про зелені облігації, то насправді це, скажімо, сутність цих облігацій в першу чергу це питання цільового використання інвестицій, да, які мають, якби, ну, вони можуть мати зовсім різні напрями, але загальна як частина стосується того, що вони, власне, мають позитивний екологічний, позитивний, скажімо, кліматичний ефект. В деяких випадках і це поняття розширюється, називається sustainable bonds, і тоді охоплюють соціальні питання. Це насправді дуже серйозні речі, які, наприклад, вирішуються на рівні держави, але зараз фактично для багатьох інвесторів це актуально, щоб і приватний сектор, скажімо, зробив ці інвестиції. І, власне, от якщо говорити про green bonds, то на цьому слайді, наприклад, ви бачите, що це може бути досить різноманітні. Це можуть бути муніципальні якісь проекти, це можуть бути промислові проекти, аграрний бізнес, наприклад, може профінансувати якісь пакети, зв'язані з адаптацією до клімату, чи біогазові установки і таке інше. Тому з точки зору якби практичних проєктів це можуть досить різноманітні речі. Але разом з тим є цілий ряд стандартів, які визначає, власне, чи відповідає ця бумага стандартам, ну, якби, зелених облігацій, да, і що є, і це є важливим для інвесторів, які вкладаються, таких як ECA чи там інших міжнародних інвесторів, приватних. От, і, власне, мова йде про те, що є 4 якби таких крупних блоки з боку якби проєктів, які фінансуються. Це, по-перше, використання цих коштів. По-друге, яким чином ці проекти оцінюються, і є певні стандарти, щоб була витримана якість в цьому відношенні. Друге, скажімо, яким чином ці кошти управляються, таким чином, щоб уникнути ризиків, які, скажімо так, роблять насправді ці облігації тільки на словах зеленими. І тут теж є певні стандарти, називаються management process. І, звичайно, те, що ми сьогодні говоримо, зокрема, це звітність. Дуже важливо, щоб ця інформація, яка була в результаті реалізації проєктів, правильно структурована і донесена інвесторам, щоб вони були впевнені, що, зрештою, прийняті ними рішення відповідають їхнім попереднім очікуванням. Тому, якщо говорити про стандарти, про зелені облігації з цієї точки зору, що визначає, що є визначальним відносно цих бумаг, то це 4 таких базових блоки, які, можна сказати, зі сторони бізнесу. Про ESG ми сьогодні ще будемо багато говорити, і колеги про це більш детально будуть пояснювати. Я зі свого боку вже зауважив, що є ESG governance, це є ціла система, як це повинно відбуватися. Якщо говорити на рівні проєктів, які фінансуються, наприклад, з допомогою зелених облігацій, то я, звичайно, би звернув вашу увагу на те, що я раніше сказав в частині ризиків, які виникають на рівні проєктів, і, відповідно, грамотне їх управління також є важливою передумовою, тому що, зрештою, ваш ESG governance, він буде відповідати очікуванням інвесторів. В цьому відношенні, що ще важливо зауважити, що це досить така різноманітна область, і там зачіпляються дуже різні, скажімо, елементи, тому це потребує певної уваги, особливо на початковому етапі щодо налаштування, тому що це стосується і, скажімо, ресурсу ефективності відходів, це стосується спільнот, які навколо вас. Ну, наприклад, земельні питання – це таке чутливе питання в Україні, коли ти реалізуєш, наприклад, великий біогазовий проект. І ком'юніті, які знаходяться навколо, відповідно, можуть бути проти цього і таке інше. Управління цими ризиками, звичайно, важливе, тому що, ви розумієте, якщо там місцева спільнота буде проти, вона може створити серйозні проблеми в цьому відношенні. І це один із елементів, який, відповідно, повинен бути відображений і управлятися з точки зору ESG, і, відповідно, відображений у звітності, щоб інвестори були впевнені, що немає для них репутаційних ризиків, наприклад, для EFC. І таке інше. Є цілий ряд блоків на цьому слайді, що я зараз відкрив. Ви можете побачити, в принципі, такі основні елементи стандартів IFC, які загально в світі признані з цієї точки зору. І, зокрема, я думаю, ви ще багато про це почуєте в частині подальшої нашої роботи з комісією впровадження цих стандартів. Ну, загалом, якщо ми говоримо про модель зелених облігацій і використання в цій практиці ESG, то я би сказав, що є дві фундаментальні речі. З одного боку, ці 4 компоненти, які я назвав відносно використання, управління ресурсу і звітності, а з іншого боку, звичайно, ENS-частина, ESG-частина щодо звітності. Тому це сутність. Що стосується ціни, наприклад, які переваги дає зелені облігації? В першу чергу, зелені облігації, зелене фінансування, зокрема, воно виграє за рахунок того, що якщо порівняти звичайні облігації і зелені облігації, ми спостерігаємо всі останні роки, що пул інвесторів, які зацікавлені вкладатися в якісні зелені облігації, зазвичай більше, ніж пул інвесторів, які вкладаються в звичайні облігації. І це важливо, особливо для країн, які розвиваються, для інвесторів і, скажімо так, емітентів, які це роблять з таких ринків. Це перший момент. Разом з тим, останнім часом ми стали спостерігати, що також, вже зважаючи на розвиток цього сегменту, в деяких випадках, в залежності від терміну цих бумаг, можуть бути і переваги щодо ціни. Це, поки що це не стійка тенденція, і треба дивитися в залежності від того, як бумага була структурована, за якою длиною, таке інше. Але це теж, в принципі, вже є. Ми спостерігаємо. Тому я би так охарактеризував. Але якщо у вас є якісь ще питання, будь ласка, задайте. Thank you, Robert.
Roman.
Yes.
Yeah, we have one more question. What rates do we see in these bonds? And will these bonds be
we
able...
also have a couple of questions.
Okay.
What are the rates for these bonds? Roman, I believe you can see them in Russian in your chat box. So maybe you will respond directly. And the second is how these bonds are going to compete with OVGZ. It should be some category of bonds, if I am not wrong. So Roman, maybe it's better for you to to answer to. Definitely, you are the best person to answer that question. Thank you.
Already a bit answered regarding preferences, so I move to question about what rates and competition with other, in particular, state bonds. If you're talking about rates, as I indicated, in general, if you're talking about international practice and practice in European region, we see that in previous years, the main kind of, let's say, benefit was pool of investor. So if, for example, you have kind of if you have, for example, your volume is exceeded by 3 times or 4 times, comparing to just 2 times, you see that you have possibility already to play with your price to some extent. Yes, so it's important from investment point, from issuers point. Я переключусь, вибачте, на українську. Що важливо, що з точки зору випуску облігацій ви маєте можливість мати більше зацікавлених інвесторів. Тобто ваш обсяг, наприклад, не в 2 рази перевищується, коли ви випускаєте, да, наприклад, якщо це ми говоримо про публічні, а набагато більше. Це якби досвід, який є в міжнародній практиці, там, в західних ринках. Тому, якщо говорити про переваги, то останні роки це більше про об'єм, про обсяг. Але разом з тим ще важливо зазначити, що по ціні не було великих різниць в основному, але були дійсно моменти, коли, наприклад, ринки дуже були нестійкі, там якісь кризи наступали, тимчасові ще щось. В цих ситуаціях для зелені бумаги в плані ціни виглядали краще і отримали кращий, скажімо, прайсинг порівняно з звичайними облігаціями. І це ми спостерігали. По мірі стабілізації ринку, да, наприклад, і, скажімо, зниження цін, ціни, як правило, знижувалися, але все рівно, скажімо так, вони були, можливо, на користь, незначну, для зелених облігацій. Це також ми спостерігали. Але якби загальна тенденція останніх років була така, що все-таки основний якби перевага зелених облігацій – це саме попит. Да? Це більший обсяг попиту на ці бумаги, якщо ми говоримо про публічний випуск. Що стосується ціни, є так звана Green Premium, але вона тільки, я би сказав, як стійка тенденція, вона тільки розвивається. Але в деяких ситуаціях, коли особливо такі якісь нестійкі макроекономічні історії, якісь ризики на ринках підвищені і таке інше, то зелені облігації зазвичай виглядали краще в цьому відношенні. Тому тут треба дивитися досить таки індивідуально. Що стосується ОВГЗ, якщо мова йде про випуски зелених облігацій державними установами, наприклад, державою, там Міністерством фінансів, як це зробили, наприклад, Польща або Франція, звичайно, якби тут можна говорити, що це якби випуски, які робляться так державою, і вони в якійсь мірі, скажімо, є альтернативою ОВГЗ, якщо це випуски держави. Але тут треба розуміти, знову ж таки, що, знову ж таки, це можуть бути трошки різні пули інвесторів. Тобто і якщо ми говоримо про зелене фінансування, це все-таки строки довші, це не короткі бумаги, да? Це проекти довгострокові, відповідної бумаги інші. Тому тут треба якби думати. Якщо ми говоримо про бумаги корпоративного сектору, про муніципального сектору, то фінансового сектору, то відповідно це вже бумаги, які якби випускаються бізнесом. З цієї точки зору, скажімо, це вже трохи інша категорія. Тому тут з якої точки зору ми розглядаємо конкуренцію. Якщо ми говоримо про емітента як державу, да, в якійсь мірі так, але разом з тим це трошки інший сегмент і трохи інший пул інвесторів може бути, зараховуючи відмінності, зокрема, в довжині цих бумаг. Якщо ми говоримо про приватний сектор, да, це можливість насправді для бізнесу, тому що вона розширює пул інвесторів. Thank you. There is also a question what tenors are possible. Як ви розумієте, Це, зокрема, залежить від того, яка держава це випускає. Є бумаги, які були випущені, наприклад, там на 8, на 10 років, да, там на 5, на 6. Вони торгуються, вони присутні, ви можете, ну, я от деякі з них згадував. В Польщі, зокрема, є бумаги, які випускалися на 20 років. От, і такі були емітенти. Тому тут питання в тому, якщо знову ж таки цікавить ситуація України, то тут треба дійсно, якби бенчмарком буде фактично випуск, вже якби існуюча практика випуску облігацій у держави, да, і відповідно з цього дивитися, які є можливості, скажімо так, там можливо продовжити ці строки, зробити їх довшими. Але, звичайно, якби визначальним є цільове використання цих коштів. Да? Якщо ми говоримо про фінансування проєктів, які мають окупність, наприклад, там 4-5 років, да? То бажано, щоб і відповідно длина фінансування цих, довжина цих бумаг, вона також була, відповідала строку якби окупності десь. Ralit, I have just answered. If any other questions, happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Roman. We'll keep on collecting the questions and we can respond to some of the questions after the webinar as well. It's great that it's sparking a lot of interest. So Professor Boeva, now back to you. You can share your presentation. Okay.
We can't see your screen, Professor Boeva. Maybe we can help you run the presentation from our end. It's now on. Professor Boeva, yes. Miro will help you.
Professor Boeva, we don't hear you.
Can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, and Mira is running the presentation for you. Yes, Professor Boeva?
Yes.
Mira is running the presentation for you.
Is it Mira running the presentation for me?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, let's start with my first slide. First of all, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to work with you. It is a pleasure because I had 2 or 3 times opportunity to work with, did you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, with Ukrainian people and also with colleagues from the National Securities Commission. Of course, it was many years ago. And I got this chance to work on some seminars. I'll stop here. I would like to share with you my view on what's going in European Union, but it will be from the perspective of my experience as a commissioner, as well my experience as a person who works with the company, and I was also a member of supervisory boards and boards of directors of few companies. So it wouldn't be a kind of academic approach, but I would like to see from the perspective of what's going about the companies. At the very beginning, I tried to point out that ECG at the very beginning was, let's say, a kind of voluntary approach in terms of disclosure. But later on in year 2014, a new directive was passed and it was transposed in local legislation about the inclusion of non-financial information in the annual reports. Be advised that in most of the countries, and I'm talking also on my personal experience about Bulgaria, the company started to disclose non-financial information in the year 2016. And it was, of course, for companies, let's say, big and middle-sized companies with more than 500 employees. Of course, talking about the, let's say, target group, it was about 6,000 entities all over European Union. Talking about companies in Bulgaria, it was no more than 100 companies listed on the stock exchange. And I would like to point out that the directive focused on the disclosure of ECG issues and, of course, on the diversity of the company boards. At that time, the directive is only about general guidance about this disclosure. But later on, next slide, please. But later on, guidelines, next slide. Okay. In the next year, new guidelines were launched. Be advised that it takes, and it took at that time for consultation. And many companies, NGOs, regulators participate in the consultations prior launching these guidelines on non-financial reporting. The focus here I'd like to point out is not binding. So the companies were companies have, and even now they have to launch this non-financial reporting, but these guidelines are not binding, so they can offer to another sources for their non-financial reporting. Here I put with a black color GRI 2017. Why? Because at that time, the European Commission included in the guidelines the essence of GRI. Maybe I'm not lobbying for GRI, but it was found out at that time many companies on the voluntary basis, they used to use GRI. So that's why guidelines from year 2017 were practically a kind of the format of GRI. Later on, in year 2019, another set of another document was launched, and it was about the necessity European listed companies, we're talking about listed companies, they have to disclose climate-related financial disclosure or information. Being part of the policy committee of European Confederation of Institutions of Directors, a kind of association of institutes of directors in Europe, in European Union, I'd like to share with you that again, at the level of the ECODA, it took a lot of time to discuss how the companies will manage to disclose this climate-related financial disclosure. Although not binding, but also the companies were encouraged to disclose. And talking about this disclosure, climate-related financial disclosure, here is Ralitza. And I would like to say that IFC workshop on ECG gave us opportunity for the first time to listen to the person that was member of the task force for the disclosure of climate-related financial disclosure. And so that's why people who are working with IFC, especially I'm talking with Ralitza, we are familiar with this set of information we have to disclose. And the focus here is, so for me, it is not new, but for people in the companies in our part of the world, it's quite new information. And also this very, very brief presentation about the content of these guidelines on climate-related financial disclosure. The focus is also about quite new materiality. It was about financial materiality on one hand, but related to the climate change. And it was especially about the investors. The target group was the group of investors. They have to get information about what is the impact of the change of the climate on the company performance. Be advised that I wouldn't like to touch what is a climate change. Provided you have questions, we can talk later on or via emails. And also, on the other hand, the companies have to disclose information. How their work, how their results impact on the climate change. And it goes here about the non-financial materiality. And here we have a group, stakeholders, investors. Why I'm talking, I'm underlying these two sides of the climate-related finance disclosure, because later on, when we move to the current trends, we'll see that companies are very much, the companies are very much engaged in this type of disclosure. Next slide, please. Usually I'm used to do myself, but something was wrong with the connection, so I refer to Miriam. So let's wrap it. We have disclosure directive with two guidelines, financial, non-financial, and climate-related financial disclosure. Next slide, please. Okay. No, previous slide. Okay, I manage myself. So it is about, as I used to say, output, what the company has to deliver. We didn't know, and we still don't know what is inside in the company, but we know that through the disclosure, we know about the results of their work with respect to protecting environment, protecting human rights. Later on, in year 2017, we faced another very important directive, and it was at that time that European Commission and then later on European Parliament, and at present companies in all European companies, they have to work on, yes. At that time, the European Parliament in this new, or let's say amended directive, underline what the owners, the investors have to do in order to impact the sustainable corporate governance at the level of the companies. And here I would like to point out that institutional investors have to be engaged in the work of the investing companies in terms of ECG, and also they have to disclose this information to their investors. So let me put this way. In year 2017, at least there was something about what the shareholders have to do, what will be on the input side in the company in terms of ECG. Later on, we move to the other side of to the output again, to the exit. At that time, Commission starts to work on the new financial plan on sustainable growth. And one of the results of this plan for sustainable growth was the taxonomy regulation. And here, I put things sustainability. And here again, the company has to disclose another very important information, and I like to point out at the end of my slides. What is behind this taxonomy regulation? Be advised that the world was puzzling the companies as well, I would say regulators. I would like to be excused because the taxonomy is not the word we used to word in our life, in our business slang, but they use this word to classify, and here is my first statement, to classify or to develop criteria in order to determine which activities are sustainable environmentally and what the investors have to finance in order to be sure that the investments and the activities are sustainable. We also at that time heard the word, even now, greenwashing. Why? Because it is very important to underline when we talk about where to put our money. The previous lecture talked about green bonds. That's the situation. So prior talking about the green bonds, we have to see, is this activity sustainable or not? Shall I put my money, excuse me, it's another very sensible issues, in the coal mining, or I should put them in the new kind of energy. So that's why the taxonomy has to put together sustainable investment, sustainable activities, and here we are in a very tough situation. Talking about we are in tough situation, I'm thinking from the perspective of the companies and the regulators. According to this regulation, the companies have to disclose a special set of 3 KPIs: the proportion of turnover, capital expenditure, and operating expenditure related to environmentally sustainable activities. So you see the progress. It is not about disclosing ESG, but we have to put together on the input what we have invested, what are the results in terms of ESG, and what we are producing in terms of financial criteria. So here is the cross, we cross ESG, production, finance, production, and of course our products. I think sustainability is the mantra all over the world, not only in Europe. Talking a few words just for a minute, beyond this disclosure and all these things, Paris Agreement, as I mentioned, our plan for sustainable growth, and see the sustainable development goals. Previous speaker talked about them. And now I'm going to another step of disclosure, which is related to the Green Deal. Green Deal is about the trends or perspective in the future development of Europe. Neutral Europe by 2050 in terms of CO2 emissions. The focus is on the development of circular economy, clean energy, restoring biodiversity, sustainable mobility, and efficient way when we are renovating our buildings. I try to go to skip. And now you're going to next step, we now talk about in Europe about sustainable corporate governance framework. So on one side, we have disclosure, also disclosure that is related to ECG and also climate-related disclosure. Also, we have to be very careful about how our disclosure is related to investment and sustainable activities in terms of taxonomy. What is important for this corporate governance framework? And it goes about the new act to the import. It is about proposals. It is not, it is on the pipeline of the European Parliament. At that time, I'm talking about year 2020, there is the discussion, what are the director's duties in terms of new agenda sustainability? Shall we add new duties or we shall just put another layer to traditional fiduciary duties? The discussion is still on. I wouldn't like to bother you, but it is very important to have a kind of set of norms in order to be sure that directors behave accordingly. Otherwise, we have reports on ECG, but we are not quite sure how do the directors react. What is their participation in the preparation of these reports? And also in the pipeline is the Due Diligence Directive. It is not about all European companies. It is about the big multinationals with more than 10,000 employees all over the world. What is this due diligence? The companies have to declare that they do their due diligence on their suppliers. And here, the focus is not just ECG, but the special focus from E, special, it is about S. The focus is how the companies are complying with guidelines for business and human rights protection. Although it is not a new document, but Europe, I mean, in many countries, there is as well at the level of European Parliament, there are voices to make this mandatory for the big companies to disclose how they're working with their suppliers on the regional and global supply chains. So in the input now, we expect what the directors have to do, and also another engagement of directors in terms of decision of their selection of their suppliers. And now we are going to a very, for me, is very relevant to the practical needs step in the development of the ECG disclosure on the European level. I put on this slide the concerns of expert groups, concerns about how many regulations on one hand, on the other directives and local laws address different type of ECG information. And all these target the companies, and they have to put together all these requirements, and in some situations, these requirements are overlapping, and the companies are producing papers and papers. So that's why this task force, this group at the this laboratory at the European level, ERFRAC, and a special task group, they started work to prepare standards, not just a kind of narrative report, but standards. And here, at the end of this slide, I especially try to attract your attention that it is not only about standards. It's not only about minimizing costs of producing reports and reports and reports, but it is about synchronizing these standards with the machine learning standards for annual financial reports. So that's why there is a kind of proposal. There will be a proposal for digital form of non-financial reporting or disclosure. I think from the perspective of the companies, it is very important. One standard, not too much reports referring to different regulations and laws. And provided I was a little bit more talkative, I use these graphs in order to make the story short. And I like to put together through this funnel how this non-financial reporting directive and respective laws, the taxonomy regulation with these new requirements for disclosure, 3 KPIs and their relevance to sustainable activities and investments, and different benchmarks, how they have to lead to these standards. And at the very beginning, I try to offer you a view about the output, what companies have to produce without knowing neither public, neither the stakeholders. What is inside, it is like a black box. Now we are in a situation, excuse me, now I'm very proud of this, all my graphs. Now we face a quite systemic approach to ESG and sustainable issues. On one hand, in the input, the investors are engaged with these ESG requirements, sustainable. Also, the directors, directives for director duties and directive for due diligence, they are engaged. They have to be, and here, this is a very tough issue. They have been knowledgeable about the sustainable issues. And on the other hand, on the outside, now output, we have to comply with these 3 regulatory documents, or we expect to have standards. And finally, I would say what we have to do. Be advised that the big problem is the implementation. Here we have commissioners. I was fascinated by the opening remarks of the teamwork from MIFE. And also we have about 62 peoples in this virtual room. But I know that it is not so easy to discuss these issues. The problem is, do the companies have capacity to do that? Are the companies capable to produce these non-financial reports? Are the board members knowledgeable? And here I put with a question mark, new language. 2 years ago, there was a discussion at the conference of US NGO series, very much involved in ESG issues. And they, at that conference and in one publications, they especially articulated that we have to speak a new language, not only as experts, but all members, we have to be educated in terms of these new requirements, the new agenda. What about, so for me, that's a great issue. And here I would like to stop because I wouldn't like to criticize anybody, but I know how tough it is to produce or to react, to comply with all these requirements. Concerning regulators, you know that in the very beginning of the case, Richard is more knowledgeable than me about the OECD principles for corporate governance. But at the very beginning, it goes about the capacity about the regulators. Do the regulators have the capacity to supervise reports? Of course, we have to disclose ECG. The EU guidelines are non-obligatory, are not mandatory. But do the regulators have capacity in terms of people, in terms of money, in terms of time to supervise all these documents which we have to produce in terms of ECG?
Thank you very much.
I stop.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Goro, for a very comprehensive, presentation. We will collect the questions, and in the meantime, I will use the opportunity to do the fast and furious of a few key concepts, connect the dots, and present some of the IFC tools and practical tools that will help you in your ESG disclosure journey. I have a high appreciation, and I'll spend just a minute here on navigating some of the key concepts, and especially of how these key terms and the nuances of their translation to local languages. Because the first time I started working on corporate governance and corporate social responsibility in Bulgaria in 2007, we had a hard time translating the concepts in Slavic. Can you mute your phones, please? Because you can hear the background noise. Thank you very much. Because the translation of the word governance and management in Slavic is the same thing. And a corporate governance is different from corporate and financial management. If the management is about running the day-to-day business, corporate governance is about making sure that it is run properly. Corporate governance is different than corporate social responsibility or business ethics, because the EU Commission has defined CSR as the responsibility of enterprises for their impact on society, and therefore it should be company-led. It's an ethical concept. It's very good when a company sponsors the youth football team or supports a local play yard or a local park, but this is not what we refer as ESG, for example. Sustainability, it's different than sustainability and what we are talking today about environmental, social, and governance factor. Sustainability or corporate sustainability refers to environmental and social factors and how they have and the impact that they have on the long-term performance of companies. In today's world and in some of the regulation, it can be used interchangeably with environmental, social, and governance factors. And this refers to the combination of environmental and social factors with corporate governance. This is a recent study. These are some examples of most common environmental and social factors. And later in the next panel, Jerome will talk about research that IFC has done of the most common factors on environmental and social responsibility. In the last year, there is 10 emerging issues. Most of them are in the social sphere, no surprisingly, because of the recent crisis on diversity, employee engagement, human rights, privacy, and security, and in economic related to supply chains, what Professor Bistra mentioned before, and business models and innovation, what Jerome talked about. So in the whole panel, we talked about that companies can no longer afford to ignore ESG issues. The disclosure of companies is only as good as the underlying practices they have. companies, but how does sustainability mean in terms of resilience in times of crisis? And to answer this question, this is a very interesting and quite remarkable research by the data provider Refinitiv, which looked at the S&P 500 companies, the period between January and May 2020, and found out that actually the more sustainable companies had 50% less losses during that time. And this is very pronounced for the sectors such as utilities, materials, and healthcare. Institutional investors are looking into ESG issues as mainstream ESG issues, and the inaction of companies comes to a cost. IFC did a research that companies in mining sector are losing over $1 million a day for non-operation due to affected communities or disruptions by stakeholders. And the recent crisis actually reiterated the importance of stakeholders, not just stakeholders for the license to operate and the operations of the business. Sustainable development goals, why do we talk about them? They can be useful for you, the companies, in a specific way. Companies can measure and report their impacts in relation to the SDGs and implement new ideas. This is what investors are looking into, the reports of companies to measure their impact. And for government organization, they can use the SDGs as inspiration and design criteria for new product development and business processes. Innovation, the regulation in terms of individual SDGs is mostly toward the SDG 12 on consumption and production, the SDG 8 on decent work, and 16 on equalities. But at the same time, when MSCI looked into 10,000 companies, they found out that although some of the most reported on or cited SDG goals on climate mitigation and green solution, goal 13, the clean energy goal 7, and the sustainable consumption and production 12, although they're the most cited, at the same time they're the one that there's most misalignment between what companies report and what they do. You heard today about different regulation, and IFC, we have been working in the ESG space for over a quarter of a century. And we have pioneered early concepts around ESG safeguards, corporate governance, and later developed industry recognized standards, like when Roman mentioned the IFC performance standards for emerging markets. And a lot of companies these days are also using them as a benchmark in their annual reports alongside the SDGs. Here you see how all these instruments are fitting together in order to foster market demands for sustainable development goals. The legislation, the ESG code, and the corporate governance codes that you just had launched recently, and which is fostering better practices. The scorecards, which is an instrument to assist and survey the ESG practices in the country, and builds on the introduction of the code, and it also helps improve the company's ESG practices. The ESG reporting guidelines, which Anthony talked about, and help companies disclose information, and with the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges, and based on their model guidelines and our own toolkit and materials, we worked in 8 countries to develop such reporting guidelines, including Kazakhstan and Georgia in our regions, and then develop tools for investors and analysts to develop on ESG. So it's what Roman started linking this to green bonds and also general purpose bonds and SDG bonds. Here are different tools that we'll share with you and that are publicly available that we have developed based on our experience, and we have helped the development of 145 laws, codes, and regulation. The major challenges, and every time I work with a company anywhere around the world on disclosure and transparency, when we start discussing, the first question is, oh, this is too costly, this is only for big companies, we cannot do it, how much can we disclose? So our competitors don't learn more than they have to. And at the same time, what investors and we IFC as an investors are looking for is forward-looking information. We don't want just to know what have happened the last 5 years, and we want to know what are the targets, what is the company aiming, and what are the business risks and opportunities for the next few years. The sources of information are expanding, not just the annual reports or sustainability reports, but a lot of the social media, communities, press releases also in local and English languages, and the artificial intelligence is helping with all this. What we typically see in the reports in our region is more marketing rather than an annual report and a boilerplate language with not much information on governance of environmental and social risk and ESG. What did we do in IFC? ESG data availability and consistency is a big issue for investors, and something that we have all the standard setting bodies are striving to improve these days. It's a very fast developing area. So what did we do? We looked into our own corporate governance methodology, our performance standards, and all the current standards, and we developed a guide that streamlines currently all the information and gives you a practical tool, a reporting partner, as some of our clients like to say it. The flexible approach that we have is focused on 3 pillars. It provides step-by-step guidance for companies, how to report material information about the company strategy, governance, and performance, and prepare reports on an integrated basis. The flexible framework has 3 pillars: strategy, governance, and performance. It aims to create dialogue inside and outside the company. The toolkit demonstrates how the 3 pillars are connected and foster not just integrated reporting, but integrated thinking within a company. The approach helps companies to be doing good, not just sounding good. And within each pillar, we provide guidance how a company can progressively disclose material ESG information, where to start in setting the strategic objectives, how to identify material issues, what does it mean, how to analyze risks and opportunities, and how to include them in the strategy and identify and monitoring. Then looking into the governance, what are the governance mechanisms and processes needed, the role of the board, the risk governance, the internal audit, and finally how to disclose the performance both on the financial and sustainability, and then actually link this and feed it back into the strategy as of next year. And it has progressive levels because some countries start at an intermediate level, some start at go to international level and strive to leadership. One of the most sort of section was actually the one where we look into the different reporting frameworks. What are they designed for? What's their main audience? This will be the Global Reporting Initiative, the Integrated Reporting Council, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, because from this depends if you're going to have one report which integrates both the financial and non-financial issues, or you're going to have separate annual and sustainability reports. If you're looking, let's say, for an indicators on different sectors, this is the Sustainable Accounting Standards framework that you're going to look into. So we're giving you a mapping tool. You heard Anthony talk about materiality, and this is a key concept that started in financial reporting, but now moves to the ESG reporting, finding the issues that you cannot cover all the issues, but finding the issues which are more important and that affect your company, and how the company affects the stakeholders. So making the selection and disclosing the process. And we have a model structure of a report, of an annual report, with guidance and examples for each of these ones. We have developed a special guidance for disclosure and transparency during COVID that is available, and that we will make available to you as well. And as we are in a digital world these days, we are transferring all of this into an online platform, which will have tools of how to disclose, learn more, and then possibilities to assess and create an outline of your report. So thank you very much. That was the fast and furious on some of the tools that we're having. So and I'm mindful that we are 15 minutes late, so Boris, back to you. And in the meantime, I'll look into questions and I can respond on the chat.
Thank you so much, personally to you and our presenters. I think it was a very interesting session. There's one question which is related to, the question is actually, does the ESG report need to be confirmed, verified by the third party? As an auditor, for instance. It's a question whether EU regulations require this.
And so no, so far not. It is recommended to have assurance of the reports, but not mandatory. Not mandatory yet. And also the different levels of assurance, and I'm sure of the ESG information, and I'm sure Anne will cover and mention this in her presentation as well.
Thank you, Rally. Unfortunately, at some point my mic was not good, so and the interpreters could not hear. So the question, I repeated for interpreters, was whether ESG report needs to be verified by the third-party auditor. I believe Ralitsa already responded to this, and you could translate it to the colleagues. So, Rally, thanks so much. It was a very interesting session. Indeed, ESG data and disclosure are critical to drive market efficiencies and open door to the opportunity. So, especially nowadays, in this new reality. And in our second session, we will have discussion with our colleagues, and our second panel will be how companies attract capital and build resilient enterprises. So we have three panelists here. We have Anne Molyneux, Richard Frederick, and Jérôme Lavin-Deville. Let me briefly introduce them to you, and also their biography is provided in the agenda. So first, I would like to introduce Anne Molyneux. Anne is director of CS International. It's a global consulting firm, and is an experienced director and former trustee of pension funds, and is a chartered accountant fellow. And is also vice chair of the International Corporate Governance Network, ICGN. So this is a global investor network with some, I think, 54 trillion under investment, if I'm not wrong, and has developed public and private sector corporate governance practices, including companies, banks, regulators, stock exchanges, and in addition to work with private sector companies and state-owned enterprises, and its clients include OECD, the World Bank, IFC, and has wide experience in Asia, South Asia, Australia, and Europe. So please welcome Anne. Our second speaker is Richard Frederick. Richard advises on issues of corporate governance and transparency, mainly for big international institutions such as World Bank, IFC, OECD, and other NGOs, and the NGOs, big NGOs. Richard was one of the principal authors of the OECD Principles of Corporate Governance, and he also contributed to OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Most importantly, Richard was a key expert who worked on the Corporate Governance Code of Ukraine that was adopted by the Securities and Stock Market Commission last March. And we have a third speaker. This is Jérôme Deville-Lavin. Jérôme is an expert in global corporate sustainability and responsible investment. He has more than 20 experience in this area in sustainability, finance, and law. Jérôme currently serves as senior consultant for IFC, and he also is a senior advisor for UN Global Compact, focusing on financial innovation and sustainability and sustainable development goals, SDGs. So Jérôme also was a key architect of SSBS standards for material sustainability disclosure and of the UN Global Compact transparency and disclosure framework. So our colleagues have prepared presentations, and we will also have a Q&A session after each presentation. You're welcome to ask questions right away after the presentation, or again, use a chat box. So let me start with Anne, who will speak on reporting on governance and crisis response, which is very important in the current situation we all live and work. So, Anne, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Boris. And Mira, will you share my screen? Thank you very much, Mira, for the slides. I am going to talk on a very practical level on reporting on corporate governance. Now, corporate governance is a massive topic. And so I'm going to focus down on the kind of reporting that we need as investors to put our money into a company. And I'm going to focus particularly on the role of the board and the role of the board in under COVID. So I'm not going to talk broadly about corporate governance, generally about the control environment or shareholder rights or the protection of minority shareholders. I'm going to leave all that. I'm just going to focus very much on the way in which reporting needs to step up generally. Companies have been making massive strides around the world, but there is a continual and increasing demand for better reporting on corporate governance matters. So I'm going to look particularly, next slide please, Mira, at the major components of reporting on corporate governance, but as I say, with a focus on the board, and then a focus on current reporting on COVID-19. This is a very new topic. There's no rules, no regulations, but there are good practices. So if we look at the next slide, I'll just give you a brief overview of what we as stakeholders, we as investors are looking for. We want to know that the company has a long-term future. That's simple, because we make our money in the future. We will get our returns in the future. And in the face of a very uncertain and turbulent and volatile future with risks that are at a velocity we have not experienced before. So we will need to know a lot about the environment in which the business is operating, but also the way in which it is approaching the environmental issues facing the company, which are different for every company, and that it has a sustainable business model and a long-term strategy. And this is the next point, is one I really want to focus on. We will look very closely at the people. A company is a legal person. It is not run by a legal person. It's run by the board. It's run by the management. And so we will always look to see to look at the competence of the board members, to see that it is well organized, well run. Company leaders can get the right information to make the right decisions at the right time and manage the risks. We do want to know that the company's under control, but I won't dwell too much on that as time will not permit. But we do want to know that the company is capable of continually growing, that it has always an eye to the future, that it can manage the present with an eye to the future. And above all, in these times, that it is financially viable in the short and medium and long term. With all that kind of information from the company, we want to be able to trust the company, its leadership and its activities. So that's the focus of the thinking of investors and stakeholders, and hopefully the focus of corporate reporting. But next slide, please, Mira. The reporting in Ukraine comes from a large number of sources: company law, listing rules, other laws and regulations. It does somewhat focus on the content for an annual report. But the starting point I've used is your new code, where Section 5 is devoted to disclosure and transparency. And the code does require that there be timely, fair, regular access to information for shareholders, but also, I feel, for stakeholders, that communications need to be regular, that information needs to be presented in an honest and balanced manner. Tell us the good and the bad, and I'll give you some examples of good and bad as we go through. Your code also mentions financial reporting. A lot of that is fairly established and fairly settled. But the new area facing all of us is the non-financial reporting, how a company will present relevant information on the governance of company, particularly its impact on the society in which it operates and the environment in which it operates also. The disclosure and transparency section in the code does require good and quality information on external audit, on dividends, dividend policy. And it mentions also specifically that you have to have a company website, which is current. So this is the focus of where the Ukraine is going. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see a bit more detail on this, because behind your code, Section 5, you will find further recommendations, further comments, and these need to be read very, very clearly and carefully, because there's an awful lot of detail in there about that you need a written disclosure policy, for example, and it needs to be made public on the website, which then should state what needs to be disclosed and how it should be disclosed. So there's a lot of requirement behind your new code. Again, it re-emphasizes that it be a balanced view presented both in your annual report and on your website, that the information be useful, but useful to who? To shareholders and to stakeholders both, not just to investors who might have their investments in the company, but rather also to employees, to supply chain, to customers, to consumers, and so on. But there's plenty more. We just don't want more information. There was a company I was looking at many years ago, and they had an annual report of some 553 pages. And really, you just got tired reading it. What we want is not more information. What we want is better information, material information, concise information. And you might well ask, if we're asking for all this additional information, how is that going to possibly be? So I'm going to go through my slides reasonably quickly, but to show you how companies out there are already providing better material and concise information. So if we move to the next slide, regarding the board, and I said we'll have the focus on the board and we'll have the focus on what the board is doing in COVID-19. We want to know that the board is well structured, that we have a board of directors, that we have board committees. And if you look at this slide, you'll see this is taken from an annual report of a fishing industry company. And it has an audit and finance and risk committee, safety and health committee, safety, health and environmental committee. So they're very much dedicated to what we would call the environment and the protection of the environment. In fact, this company has already issued blue bonds, bonds that are very much focused on development of the projects in development in the oceans and in the fishery industry. But you'll see then there are the board committees. In the light blue lines, then you have the chief executive officer who reports to the board of directors, and he appoints his executive team. He has his business units. This simple diagram tells me they've thought about their structure, their reporting lines, the work that the board has to do, the work that management has to do separately, and they've put it all in just a simple diagram. And if you move to the next slide, you will see here is another example of a bank. This is a bank in South Africa. This bank in South Africa has put its focus on not just the structure of the board, but how it handles all the activities the board must undertake. So instead of putting it in pages of writing where the information gets lost, they put it in a diagram that they focus on board governance, on risk governance, on finance and treasury governance, and on social and environmental governance. This gives me comfort that this bank is in fact addressing the kinds of issues I think as an investor they should be focusing on. And you'll notice it to the heart of that diagram, they show that their central focus in governance is about outcomes of ethical leadership, good performance, effective control, and trust and legitimacy. So there's more information in their annual report about this structure, but it's all said in a simple diagram that can give me comfort as an investor that I can trust them, they seem to know what they're doing, and they're organized for it. If you move to the next slide, we always want to be sure that the board of directors leads the company, approves the strategy, monitors and oversees the management, but doesn't get down into actually doing the work of management. And this is an excerpt from another annual report, which shows they very clearly understand the separation of the role of the board in the middle from that of the chief executive on the right and the chairman on the left. They've said, they write down, they state for all the world to see that this is what these groups and individuals should be doing in a very clear manner. So again, what it tells me that the board is well structured for their activities, and I can read through those to understand they do have the key activities there and that they are managing them. If we go to the next slide, I'm using this example of a bank in Kenya, KCB Kenya. And KCB Kenya do report very, very well. But I've seen annual reports with photos like this of the board. Now, if I'm an investor who's going to vote on the new directors, who's going to actually vote on the current directors, is a name and a position and a picture sufficient? It's definitely not. But this does tell me a story. It tells me that this board is gender diverse, racially diverse, and it also probably tells me they seem to be quite happy individuals. But it's on its own, it would not be enough. But if we move to the next slide, you'll see more information that they give about the board. Because as an investor, I would want to know that the board of directors of a bank is competent, and it's competent in banking, in financial services, in audit, in strategy, and so on. And if you look down the names of those board directors, it gives you a picture of the kind of industry experience and competences that they have. So again, this is more information, but you can see when you're looking at your corporate governance, you've got to look at the board, its role, its structure, the people themselves and their skills and competences. So this is what is going to be required in reporting just on the board. If you move to the next slide, there's even more information. This is the same bank still. This is about the information on the chairman and on a board member. But it also tells you more about their background. It tells you about their current board appointments and what board committees they're on. And the one thing I think I miss a little bit in this is it doesn't tell me if they're independent directors. I want to know who are the independent directors. So if I need to contact them, I can. So this is very good information and very full. So what am I saying about this? When you're looking at the board, you need full information about the structure of the board, about the board committees, about the board individuals themselves, their roles, their competences, and so forth. And some companies, now this is not the same company, but can we go to the next slide, please, Mira? Some companies actually put it out as a board matrix. It's a very useful tool to summarize the qualifications and experience of the board. And this is taken from Prudential. And it shows me the experiences of the board, but it also shows me this board has very few directors with environmental and sustainable and corporate responsibility experience. So if I see that this board is going into, and it is, ESG investing, me as an investor in this company would say, well, yeah, my next directors really do need to have more environmental sustainability and corporate responsibility experience. So we would want to see that increased across the board. So this is what I am saying about not only corporate reporting, but it's not just about the information you provide, but also how you provide it. And if we look at the next slide, remember I said, I want to know who the independent directors are. In your code in the Ukraine, you are requested to have 1/3 of the board being independent directors. And you need to target, and you'll be given the target to try to target 50% of the board. Well, you can see here, this board has a vast majority of directors are independent, but it's very clear which ones are not. So that's the kind of disclosure that really I'm looking for on the board. Quite detailed, comprehensive, telling it all. And when you come to independence, if you have a director who's been on the board a long while, say more than 9 years, and you think they're independent, after 9 years, in good practices, it's assumed they're not yet independent unless you can prove it so. So you might need further disclosures as well. So that's the kind of disclosure we're looking for regarding the board. But we're actually looking also for information on what the board is doing. Now, in this year of COVID, and if we move to the next slide, we want to know a lot about the board activities and how it's managing specifically COVID-19. Now, I have sat on a board through COVID-19, and I have to say, and all this information I'm about to tell you is public information, so I'm not breaching any confidence. But I would say on sitting on the board during COVID-19, it's a very pressured circumstance. You want to see that the board is overseeing the crisis, and did they establish, which we did, a crisis committee? Who's on the crisis committee? We had our chair, our vice chair, our CEO, and our COO. We were much more active. Instead of a board meeting, say once every 6 weeks, we had a crisis committee meeting every week because the circumstances were changing massively by the minute. We want to know if we have a crisis committee, how many times they're meeting, what are the issues at the meeting, do we need to change our strategy, what are the changed working conditions for the board, for the staff, for the employees. What does that mean? I mean, if I can give you the example, being on a board of a company where 70% of its revenues came from conferences. Well, if you can't travel, you have no conferences, no international conferences. So we had to figure out 70% of our revenues. So we had to change our strategy, change our business model. All this information is what's important to shareholders, to report it as it is. But where do you report it? In the course of this year, some countries have annual reporting closures in March. Well, COVID had barely got going then. So I'll give you later an example of Vodafone in the UK, who reported in March, and they didn't have much to say because they also were in telecommunications, so it wasn't really affecting them tremendously, but it was affecting their employees and their workforce and methods of working. But if in fact you reported in June, as Singapore Airlines did in June, and it's worth reading Singapore Airlines annual report for their COVID contributions, I would suggest you need to look very carefully at the content of their annual report. We do understand, certainly COVID-19 has broadened the perspective of board responsibility, particularly for employees, for workplace safety, for changes in technology and changes in quick and rapid agility in changing strategies. A massive change to over-management and oversight of risk management. The new thing with risk management is the velocity of risk, the speed of change. But all of these things here have had to be addressed. But fundamentally, some companies have had to move very quickly to access capital. If you think about Singapore Airlines as in the aviation industry, 93% of their income disappeared with the cessation of flights. So they immediately went to their credit providers. They also had a rights issue. They also went with their major shareholders to get support for the rights issue at the emergency general meeting. So you will see there's a lot behind it. And I'll just now move, if we move to the next slide, and I'll move through quite quickly. This is a survey of investors in May 2020, undertaken by the Boston Consulting Group. Investors want companies to be transparent and honest, to give more information, faster information, more frequent information, and so forth. But the kind of information that a Singapore Airlines, for example, was giving, if we move to the next slide. Oh, this is the tip sheet that IFC has introduced and many other support materials for COVID reporting. But if we move to the next slide again, you will see Singapore Airlines in their annual report to June 2020 had 4 whole pages of a separate report on COVID, but certainly a lot of other information on their financial impact, company liquidity, safeguarding employees, in-flight measures, and so on. But I just want to read to you 2 or 3 excerpts from their report. They say the crisis has undoubtedly pushed Singapore Airlines Group's operational and financial capacity to the limit. COVID-19 is the greatest challenge in Singapore Airlines history. It is an unprecedented impact on the aviation industry and caused for us a sudden and precipitous fall in air travel. This is what we mean by telling it as it is. Now, there are no rules for COVID disclosures, but what an investor really wants is to hear all information that is material to either the value of the company or to its company operations. So there's a lot to be understood in terms of corporate reporting. I think if I move through to the last slide, please, Mira, I'll just pause on this. If you look at this example, you will see here in January 2020, this is a bank in South Africa. This was their top 5 risks on the left-hand side. But by the time they got to finalizing their annual report in February 2020, you'll notice the top 5 risks have changed. Liquidity risk has moved in there, capital risk has moved in there and become a major focus. But moving to the very last slide, Mira, not this next slide again. This is going back to this slide. This is the final slide and the point at which I'd like to leave you with. This is a survey done by PricewaterhouseCoopers of the investor community. My perception of the quality of a company's reporting impacts my perception of the quality of its management. And 88% of all investors said yes to that. So I think I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. I didn't cover all of corporate governance, but I wanted to focus just on the board and board activities during COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, and I believe you can hear me well, right?
Yes, I can, Boris.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. I think it was very interesting presentation. I would like to ask, do we have any questions? There was only one question, but I think it was not related to this particular session. This was a general question, what's happening in Ukraine in terms of ESG disclosure and what are the planned activities. So maybe we can ask our colleagues from the Commission to respond to it. But first, let's see if there are any questions. Dear colleagues, please don't be shy. I believe you will have many questions. Yeah. So there is a question, is there a difference in terms of reporting during the pandemic? What's the difference in terms of reporting between private sector companies and state-owned enterprises during the pandemic? Thank you.
During the pandemic, every company, I believe, whether it be a state-owned enterprise or a private sector company, needs to be very clear and give regular communications to their stakeholders. An employee in a state-owned enterprise is equally interested in the health and safety of their workplace or their capacity to work from home, or the company's strategy for his future financial safety and employment. I think all companies need to understand that under COVID, you do really need to report generally to all stakeholders that breadth of information I was talking about. ESMA, the European Securities Markets Group, have in fact issued a guideline on COVID-19. It's not compulsory, but it does give you some information. And the Financial Reporting Council in the UK does give you more information as well on what might be included. But there are not many examples yet out there, because the UK reporting was a little bit early and European reporting is just coming up now. So I think if you look, say, out to Australian reporting or Singaporean reporting, you'll see some good examples of reporting on COVID activities. But I think private sector companies should be no different to state-owned enterprises. The general principle about state-owned enterprises is that they should operate as close as possible as normal companies and perhaps apply your code as well.
Thank you. And I think it's a very right point indeed. You know, SOEs, wherever possible, they should follow the practices of private sector companies. And I also have a question to you. So you mentioned communication with stakeholders. So my question is, you know, what would be the first group of stakeholders you would address first, and what would be the frequency of communication with them? Thank you.
Horace, that's a question that's asked all the time. The most important stakeholder group will be different for every single different company. If, for example, you're a bank and you're currently got problems with your tier 1 capital, your probably most important stakeholder is going to be the national bank, the central bank, at a particular point in time. Every company needs to make a list of all their stakeholders that might be interested in their company, and then find out, by means of looking at their impact and the probability of their impact and the size of their impact, which ones are most important, and prioritize them. And if you're a mining company, it might be the local community that's surrounding your mines. If you're, say, Singapore Airlines, is it your staff? Is it your shareholders? Is it your regulator? It will change according to time, circumstance, and every company should do a regular review of the materiality and importance of their stakeholder groups. And it will vary from company to company from time to time.
Thank you. I think it's a frank answer, and yeah, I agree with your point. Definitely, it depends on the type of the company, its challenges it's faced at the moment, and so it's really a very unusual situation we all are today, and definitely it requires, you know, extraordinary actions, smart reaction, and following circumstances. Do we have any other questions, dear colleagues? Maybe you would like ask one or two questions. We still have time. I haven't forgotten about the question about envisaged ESG regulatory changes, so we will get back to that. Maybe we'll ask Timur in his closing remarks to address that. So,
Boris, I can't hear you.
If we don't have any more questions, and I would like to thank you. Thank you so much. It was a very interesting presentation, to the point, and definitely, you know, it's very challenging time. We've been already living with COVID for exactly 1 year. And some experts say the world will never be the same again. So we need to, how to say, it's lots of uncertainty around, and we need to be more innovative and definitely paying more and more attention to sustainability, including in investment. So thanks so much. And so with your permission, I would move to our next speaker. So definitely ESG data and disclosure are critical to drive market efficiencies. It opens the door to investment opportunity. So I will ask Richard to speak about expectations of different groups of capital providers, right? With respect to information they would like to have, including on sustainability. Richard, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boris, and good morning, everyone. It's been a great morning. It's been very interesting to listen to everyone. Where would I like to start? Well, I think I'd like to start with the agenda. Let me just share this very quickly.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure if we can see it. Basically, I just highlighted the point.
We can
see it
on the screen.
Great, I can't, but if you can, great. This is the objective of the meeting. Disclosure and transparency are critical for attracting capital and for building resilient enterprises. Transparent corporate reporting and integrating ESG increases trust and confidence for investors, and it provides critical insights. Corporate reporting may also shed light on how companies create different types of long-term value. So I just wanted to put my presentation in that context. What I'll try and do is talk about the investor perspective. So let me see if I can get this one up. Before I start, I'd like to go back to what Relitsa and Boris said at the very beginning, which is they were talking about different perspectives. We have a panel with lots of different perspectives here. And I suppose that in some ways I have to provide the old man perspective. Forgive me for being an old man. It was accidental. It wasn't my intention, but here we are. What have I done over the years that I've been working in this field? In the 1990s, I worked at the OECD, and I represented the OECD to the International Accounting Standards Committee before the International Accounting Standards Board was even created. From there, I moved at the OECD to work on corporate governance. So I've got very much of a governance perspective on these matters. From that, gradually, I moved into environmental and social reporting, but mainly from the company and the investor perspective. I was also at IFAC for some years, and shortly after the financial crisis of 2008, I worked at a private equity investor, and there I gathered more of a fund perspective. So let me see, are we sharing my presentation now? I can't really see.
Yes, Richard, it's on the screen, so please go ahead. Yeah, it's on.
Great. So, as I was preparing for the conversation, this presentation over this past week, I was doing a lot of sort of internet searches and making sure that I was up to date on stuff. And yesterday, the day before, I was having coffee and cookies in the morning, and I ran into the perfect article to start the conversation. When I say cookies, I didn't actually have cookies at all. What I had was internet cookies, and the internet provided me with this article. It had basically been listening or watching to what I had been looking at over the week, and suddenly served me up with this perfect article. Remember the cookies, because I'll get back to those at the end of my presentation. So what did the article say? It said, the impact of ESG scores on stock valuations has increased sharply and is now the highest in 5 years. That means that investors are using ESG information for stock valuations. It also said that the data that's available for measuring companies' ESG performance is far from reliable. It listed some of the obstacles. The first one here is the definition of ESG is broad and ambiguous. I know from personal experience that even a G indicator can sometimes contain, or a G score can sometimes contain hundreds of indicators. And if we add E and S to it, we're talking potentially high hundreds. There's a difficulty in assigning a single rating to a company as a consequence. And it's very difficult to compare sustainability performance across industries. And even though we've got way more information on ESG, the quality of this information remains somewhat uneven. At the same time, the article was fascinating because it showed that money keeps on pouring in. In the US, ESG funds attracted 28 billion in the year 2020. And that is more than the total over the past 5 years. So it's really turning into an enormously important theme. And the article also said that ESG focused trading funds drew in 4.1 billion, and that was just last week. Quite amazing if you think about it. So why are investors integrating this into their reflection? Well, there's also some information on polls that were done of investors. And the response was that 42% of financial service professionals say that it's improving their long-term returns, and that was the main motivation. Another reason is risk mitigation. They want to understand if the company that they're investing in is being subjected to any particular risks. And 22% is from clients. And I think that last figure is interesting as well, because it indicates that clients may not actually be the driving force. It's not just to please the clients that investment funds are doing this. And to finalize the article, 70% of respondents expect climate change to be the biggest driver over the next 3 to 5 years. And 72% felt that the S, or the social element of it, is the most difficult factor to integrate and analyze. So what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to examine a little bit more these information users. I come from a traditional disclosure, accounting and audit background. And this is the universe of users that you might run into. In the left-hand column, we've got different types of users. Banks are obviously users of financial reports, significant users. Then there's this term, which is thrown around fairly loosely, the markets, the financial markets, as if it was a monolithic group of institutions. It's not. We've got all sorts of different types of investors within this group. We have active investors. That means that they're investors who are analyzing the performance of companies, not only their financial performance, but maybe their ESG performance. But then you've got an entire new group of investors that have emerged over the past 20 years or so, which are passive investors or index fund investors. They just track indices. And in most cases, they're not really doing any fundamental analysis at all. And then finally, you have momentum traders. And those are investors who are making their decisions based on the momentum that the equity might have. Well, in other words, if there's a psychological interest, or you can measure an interest in an equity, they might invest. If they feel that the interest is waning, they might divest. The interesting thing about these different types of investors is that they're using information very differently. For active investors, the ESG information is a gold mine. For passive investors, it might only be used in a very limited way. For momentum traders, they're not going to be using it at all. What is my point here? The point that I'm making is that the markets are not monolithic. There are different types of investors out there. Each one will be using information differently, and each one will be using ESG information differently. The rest of the slide shows other types of users. We've got employees, stakeholders, the press, the public, and so on. And each of these different groups will have different interests. Now I want to take a closer look at this group of investors that we're talking about. And I want to subdivide it again, but this time slightly differently. So the left-hand column shows different types of investors. It starts with angel investors, it goes to venture capitalists, to private equity, to investors in the primary markets, in the secondary markets, and then finally bondholders. There is a reason that I've ordered it this way, and that is it goes from level of risk to a relatively high level of risk to a relatively low level of risk. So here, take a look at angel investors, for example. Angel investors, it might not be a term that translates easily into Ukrainian, but it means someone who gives you money, possibly because they're a friend or they believe in a cause to invest in, and they don't really even expect a financial return. That is a highly risky investment. It's typically given to enterprises that have virtually no experience up and running, that are starting with an idea. And that's why I say here in the slide, it's the highest risk. It's on a wing and a prayer. So it's basically hope driven. And then we've got venture capitalists. These tend to invest in businesses that have some experience, some years of experience behind them, and are typically proven concepts that are then expanding, and they need the money to expand. Then you've got private equity, which is usually aimed at restructuring enterprises that have probably done well in the past, have possibly faltered, and through restructuring, they can be put on a sounder ground and made more profitable and then resold. I think it's also important to distinguish between primary markets and secondary markets. When I say primary market, I mean when a company goes to the market with an initial offering. It takes its shares, it sells it to investors, and money goes to the company. The secondary markets don't function that way. In secondary markets, I, as a shareholder, Richard Frederick, might sell my share to someone else, Anne Molyneux or Boris or Ralitza or whoever's in the audience, and the money does not go to the company. The money is exchanged between me and other people. So we don't provide capital to the company directly. And then there's bondholders who do provide company, typically money to the company directly. And the need for disclosure, the use of disclosure, is going to be different in each and every one of these groups. So in the top category, angel investors and venture capitalists, private equity investors as well, they're probably not going to be relying very much on disclosed information. Why? Because they have a very privileged access by working directly with the company. On the other hand, the primary and secondary markets are very interested in the data that we disclose because they don't have a privileged access. I don't have privileged access into a company that I might own in a stock portfolio. So I rely on disclosure, and that would be typically regulated disclosure. Okay. Now I'd like to take a look at different strategies that funds, these would be typically secondary market investors, but not necessarily, might pursue. This is a slide that I actually developed probably in around 2008, 2009. I've shortened it a little bit. When I was working at a private equity investor and fund firm, and I was asked to propose different funds that we might create that would then be offered to the public. And you can see that there were 5 different types of funds that we considered at some point. And the very bottom, each receives a rating. And I put in $ and hearts. At that point, I was thinking, well, how do I distinguish between the different objectives of these funds? The $ obviously meant money, and the heart obviously meant social conscience. And going from left to right, I proposed various approaches that we could use. The simplest one was the Due Diligence Fund. That's something that I came up with, a strategy that we could use as a private equity investor. And that was simply to examine ESG issues and find out whether or not there were any risks that had been overlooked that we needed to understand. And really all we were trying to do was understand if our acquisitions were going to be risky or not. The next fund that we considered developing was a screening fund. By that I mean, we took a look at a universe of potential investments, and we decided well, if it's, let's say, in the tobacco industry, or if it's in the armaments industry, or if they were producing alcohol, that we would prefer not to invest in them, and therefore we left them out of the investment portfolio. So that's a screening type of a fund. We were still very much interested in generating money, but we wanted to create something that had a little bit more of a social aspect to it. Then we had thematic funds, which were trying to focus on clean industries. And then further to the right, we had what we called an engagement fund. And there we considered developing a fund that would actually engage with companies to try to encourage them to act more responsibly. So you see, from left to right, we have a completely different form of interaction with our investees. And then finally, on the far right, we have something that we called an impact fund. And that fund was less interested in the economic return for us as a private equity investor, and was much more interested in generating social benefits. And as a consequence, it has 3 hearts and $1 sign. So this is just to illustrate that different funds and investors can have very different strategies in terms of how they approach the market. All right. So that was what I just described to you were the questions that we considered as a private equity fund. But what about mainstream investors? And I'd like to talk a little bit about them for a second. Basically, one of the biggest issues that mainstream investors have today, I believe, is the fiduciary question. What do I mean by that? There really are 2 ways of investing, and we saw that from the previous slide. One is using traditional financial indicators for traditional objectives. Another way is to use emerging ESG indicators and possibly for social objectives. And when you link these 2 indicators together, the traditional and the ESG, it's often referred to as integrated investing. And there's something called integrated reporting that is designed to meet the needs of integrated investors. Now, if you take a traditional view of investing, sustainable development or corporate social responsibility or ESG are considered by old school investors, by some old school investors, as a distraction from the fiduciary duty that the company has and the investor has to shareholders. New views suggest that this is not the case, and that in fact these 2 views are complementary. But before I get to that point, I would like to talk about this a little, or I'd like to talk about this issue a little bit more, because it is sort of a burning issue. What is this slide about here? This slide talks about something that just happened 10 days ago now, maybe it's 3 weeks, 15, 20 days ago right now, which is the US Department of Labor released a final rule on trends involving ESG investing. So what's ERISA and why is this important at all? Well, ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act in the United States, and it regulates the way that private pension funds are allowed to invest in the US. And why do I talk about the US? Well, because the US and US funds are very often big international investors. So the thinking there is actually interesting to us as well. It's also interesting because it's a government response to this issue of ESG investing. And this new final ruling says that the amendments to the ruling say that investments must be based on pecuniary factors. I have to translate pecuniary. I don't know if it's easily understood. That means monetary factors. And that means that any factor must have a material effect on risk and or return of an investment. And this should be the primary decision-making criterion for for pension funds. Here I've got two quotes that relate to this ruling. One is by the US Secretary of Labor. The other one is the Assistant Secretary of Labor, and I'll read them. This rule will ensure that retirement plan fiduciaries are focused on the financial interests of plan participants and beneficiaries rather than on other non-pecuniary, non-monetary goals or policy objectives. And the Assistant Secretary of Labor said that plan fiduciaries should never sacrifice to participants' interests in their benefits to promote non-financial goals. All right. I'm going to move fairly quickly. This ruling was very hotly debated in the United States because some people felt that it prevented investors from looking at ESG factors. In fact, I don't think this is the case at all. I think that what it does is it definitely permits them, and it even obliges them in some sense to take a look at ESG factors to the extent that those ESG factors are material. And the broad sense among the investment community is that they are definitely material. The ruling helps us understand how to put financial considerations, the traditional ones, in context with, or how to put ESG considerations in context of traditional considerations of investors. So now I'd like to go and take a further step in the few minutes that remain. I think I've got about 4 or 5 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, and talk about standards of disclosure. You may remember from the article that I mentioned in the beginning that standards were mentioned as a problem in ESG reporting. One of the problems is that there's different standards, lots of them. The relevance of the indicators within the individual standards is sort of uncertain. We're not sure exactly which indicator is most important. And then we don't know how to weight E versus S versus G, or the indicators within each of these different standards. We're still confronted with this problem about how to integrate intangible values into our financial investment decisions. And there's the vulnerability of information to manipulation and also greenwashing. Now, this is a slide that I prepared probably about, well, it's 10 or 11 years ago now, and I did not change it for this presentation, and I hope you excuse me for not doing so. This is unupdated. Back then, the point was really simple. The point is that there are a lot of standards. And if you think that there were a lot of standards 10 years ago, then now you can imagine there's more. I'm sure that there are double, if not more than that. These standards deal with all sorts of issues. They're topical, they can be E, S, and G. They can deal with corruption, they can deal with voting. They're functional standards. That was a nomenclature that I came up with to deal with accounting and auditing or internal audit and so on and so on. I think that the point here is that there's a lot, and how to comply with all these different standards, how to report on all of them is confusing. And I ask the listeners to compare this to accounting standards. Accounting standards, typically we just want IFRS, but that's it. It's IFRS. So for financial reporting, we really have one benchmark. But for ESG, it's considerably more complex. Here's another slide, and this is looking at one area, the G, in which I feel most comfortable talking about because that's where much of my experience is. This is also a slide that I produced for IFC for a presentation quite some years ago. What this slide does, or what this study did when I was working on it, was it compared 5 different corporate governance ratings agencies and how they rated corporate governance. And I looked at all of the criteria that they were using to evaluate corporate governance, and I found something that was really quite surprising. So on the left-hand column, you see the ratings criteria, and I've selected just a small subset which is management of audit and auditor independence, okay? And on the right, you see 1, 2, 3, S&P, Standard & Poor's, everybody knows that. Institutional Shareholder Services, that's what it used to be called. I think they've changed their name, and so on. These are the different ratings agencies. The point that you can take from this is that the different rating agencies were looking at different factors. So even within people who were extremely competent in their fields, who were reputable and were relied on to provide these ratings, there were enormous differences in what they were looking at. My timer just said I'm up to 20 minutes. Boris, I'm getting close to the end. Please, I'm almost there, another 3 or 4 minutes, I hope.
It's okay, Richard, no worries. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So here's the point, is that even within the experts, it's not sure which of these things we should be looking at. Let me take a look at the audit contract. S&P wanted to see an audit contract with the auditor, and they wanted that described, and they wanted to analyze that contract in their corporate governance evaluation, but no one else did. How about auditor fees? Well, auditor fees was something where everybody agreed upon. There were 4 occurrences among the 5 different standards that we do, or rating agencies. So you have some confidence that that's a fairly important thing. And then there are reasons for disagreements or dismissal of an auditor. Only one of them considered that. So there's no agreement, or there wasn't, at least in those days. I think that to some extent this situation persists. And also, if we try and link this to empirical evidence on what impacts performance, it's not at all so clear. So I'm going to skip this slide, and I'm going to take a look at another issue. In the last slide, I said here, it's statistically really hard for us to tell what is material, what it is going to impact our investment decision. And there are hundreds and hundreds of indicators that all of these different ratings agencies are using. So how can we perhaps decide? Let me go forward and not backwards. Artificial intelligence. So this is a new area to talk about in the area of disclosure. I've entitled the slide, Meet the New Guy on the Investment Team. And I'm just throwing this in because it's a fascinating new tool that is available to investors to make some of these decisions. And it might in future really alter the way the investment process works and alter our concept of disclosure and information. What is artificial intelligence? Well, artificial intelligence is just basically a form of mimicking, for machines to mimic what we do quite naturally as human beings. We think and we analyze. What is machine learning? I think this is considered a subset of artificial intelligence, and it's really quite fascinating because not only are we looking at machines as tools to, let's say, analyze data, but machines are increasingly capable of learning themselves how to analyze data, and it can be completely unstructured. And this is the fascinating aspect about it. I was recently interviewing an individual who works in the City of London, and he describes to me how they use machine learning to make investments. The machine, the computers are simply filled with or fed with completely unstructured data. And through looking through their algorithms, they're able to discern themselves what is relevant and what isn't. So for example, the machine might follow weather patterns in Western Africa and decide whether or not those weather patterns are somehow going to influence the price of cocoa beans as a commodity, and that may in turn trigger an investment decision. So it doesn't rely on structured disclosure. It relies on whatever information is available, and these machines are gathering information that is freely available through the internet. They're just aggregating the information and are left alone to analyze it. In some cases, the owners of the machines don't even know how the analysis takes place. What are the advantages of this? Well, you can deal with enormous volumes of data. It's fast. You can identify the real drivers, so you address the confusion that we had before about corporate governance with hundreds of indicators. And you can reduce bias in the decisions. Added to this is a new field called NLP, Natural Language Processing, which is even allows investors to listen or to record a roadshow meeting with the executives of a company and understand through analysis of language, even tones of language, what is relevant and what isn't. So AI is potentially a response to this issue of materiality. We don't need to decide what's material anymore. The machine will in fact do this for us. And in some ways, it's also a response to differing reporting standards. AI doesn't care about the reporting standards. It just cares about the access to the information. And in some ways, it also addresses this concept of greenwashing, because it's very hard to fake out the machine with false data. So I'm closing now. Thank you for your patience. Here are my summary points. The use of ESG data is exploding. There are different users of the data, and different capital providers will have different strategies and use the information very differently. Information for the capital market is typically regulated data and structured, and it has to be material. Non-material information is unregulated and can be subject to manipulation. I think that it's clear that disclosure and disclosure standards are going to evolve very dramatically over the years that come. But non-pecuniary disclosure will also increase and evolve. Irrespective, all issuers, all seekers of capital will need to consider their impact on sustainable development. And I would say that even for those who are not accessing the capital markets, they too will need to consider ESG issues simply to better interact with their stakeholders. And with that, I will close. Thank you for your patience. If there's any questions, I'd be pleased to respond.
Richard, many thanks. I think it was a very interesting presentation. You know, lots of think about, and especially I liked, you know, the last slide about artificial intelligence and that it can replace, you know, and it can itself assess whether the information is material or not. So it sounds very, very interesting, you know. So I believe we have very interesting times ahead. And we have a couple of questions. So the first question is about, you know, ESG disclosure in case of state-owned companies. So definitely, SOE agenda is very important in Ukraine at present. So, and the question is, since SOEs have a social function as well, right? So is there any sort of special reporting in terms of ESG in case of SOEs? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. A form of that question, or variant of that question, was addressed to Anne, and I think that Anne addressed it perfectly. I think that the model for state-owned enterprises, both in the area of corporate governance and also in the area of disclosure, is private company disclosure. So this is something that you will find, I think, in the Ukrainian corporate governance code, that the ultimate model for state-owned enterprise disclosure should be listed company disclosure. That being said, I should add one more thing, is that state-owned enterprises have a particularity, and that is that the disclosure requirements and the control and the audit requirements placed upon state-owned enterprises often far outstrip that of private enterprises. So the temptation is always to add more and more and more and more disclosure requirements, in particular to state-owned enterprises. And I think that many state-owned enterprises themselves would complain about the fairness of that. They want to be held on an equal footing with the private sector. And the OECD guidelines on SOEs would suggest that we need to have an even playing field. So the answer is be fair, be even.
Thank you, Richard. I think, yeah, I fully agree with you. Definitely, we should aim that SOEs follow the same practice as private sector companies. Maybe some other questions. Vladimir, I can see you, so maybe you have a question.
Yes.
This is my colleague from Belgrade office, Vladimir Herale. Please.
Hello to all, and thanks, Boris, for the invitation. And Richard, this is a question to you, and good to see you again. Do you think it is realistic to expect that there will be some sort of a global attempt to unify those scattered ESG standards? In the long term, because I understood from your presentation, it will not happen in the near term, but in the longer term, do you think it's realistic to expect? Because from my reading of your presentation, it would definitely be the move in the right direction.
You know, Vlad, it's a wonderful question. In the beginning of my presentation, I said, I apologize for being older. The truth is that we've been going through variants of this conversation literally 25 years ago. And at that point, I was quite intimately involved in accounting issues and trying to, there was a movement at that time to try and make accounting more adapted to sustainable development issues. The idea was to completely alter the accounting model and make it a unified model that would take into account the welfare impact of companies and to report it in one single sort of balance sheet financial statement. And I understand that all of this was very well motivated. And I think in the long term, it probably does make sense. But in the short term, back then we decided there was just no way it was going to happen. There are a huge amount of technical difficulties. And remember, financial accounting, financial reporting had 500 years now of experience, and we're just beginning with this environmental stuff. I think that in the long term, it might be possible, but for the moment, I'm afraid that we have to feel comfortable with this messiness, this messiness that we experience, and try and, I think that eventually the standards will begin to coalesce. I'll also say that in 1997, I was sitting in a conference like this one. Some of you may actually have been there. And a gentleman named Michael Hegarty from the World Bank, but also from the European Federation of Accountants, said, there are so many corporate governance standards around there, we need to have one. And he was right. At that time, there were probably around 20 of them. And we created one out of that, and that was the OECD one. So is it possible? You bet it is, Vlad. When it's going to happen, I don't know. Are we ever going to be able to combine E, S, and G? I don't think so. And I see Anne waving at me. So I think that if you don't mind me taking over the moderation position for a second, Boris, I always like listening to Anne because she's quite sharp on these issues. Anne, why don't you just chip in there?
Thank you very much. I sit on the IIRC, the Integrated Reporting Council, and the Integrated Reporting Council and several others of these groups like the GRI, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Change, the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, and the SASB have come together. Now it's going to be, they've all got different standards at this stage, and you're quite right, Richard, that it's actually very confusing and quite a mess. But they have come together to try to solve this issue of coming up with one standard. Now, that's one initiative. There is another initiative happening at the EU level, and that will be applicable across all EU countries. And Bistra mentioned this earlier. The EFRAG committee has been asked by the European Commission to see if there is a way of developing one set of standards for non-financial reporting, which of course then includes ESG reporting. So those are two initiatives. Now, whether they work out, and it takes a long time to get a set of standards together, it will take time, but I think there are initiatives and they're happening now.
And there is a third initiative, actually, the World Bank Group, as we speak now, is responding to the consultation paper of the IFRS Foundation on integrating ESG issues into financial reporting. And we did speak with the IFRS Foundation. They're very, because there is a great push for convergence in the field. And they're looking into developing a sustainable standards board. The questions they're currently asking, should they focus in the beginning just on climate disclosure or broader set of material ESG issues? So there is a fast development in the field. How long is it going to take? And how is it going to converge all the questions? All the standards, that's a different questions, but this is moving forward.
Well, I think there we've heard it from people who are better informed than me. So I really appreciate y'all backing me up on that. What I can say in addition, perhaps, is that there's challenges on the technical level. And I think a lot of us are familiar with that. But there are massive challenges that typically are not so visible on the political and on the institutional level. And I remember that very well from way back when we were trying to encourage IFRS against the will of many different countries who had different accounting standards. Who leads and what institution eventually gets the leadership role is a sensitive question. Any further questions that we have? If not, there was one by Oksana Paraskeva, but I want to give you back the control, Boris, and direct me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Richard. I think we already addressed Oksana's questions. They were related to specific ESG reporting standards. We have one question from Andrew Pospielowski. Andrew, please don't think that I am ignoring your questions, but this is something which I see I will respond to in the closing remarks. So we will touch what IFC is doing and what we are going to do. So it will be more related to that. Richard, would you like to add anything from your side?
Yeah, now that I'm rereading Oksana's comment, and I realized that I should have added a bit of nuance to my response. She was asking about SOEs and social reporting. SOEs do have different goals from normal enterprises. Normal enterprises can be understood that it's largely profit motive, and SOEs, if they are SOEs for a good reason, have got some sort of a social goal. And the OECD does encourage reporting on what that social goal is, first of all, and secondly, what your performance is against the achievement of that social goal. So in that regard, there is a difference from SOEs. So I'm glad I looked at the chat, because that allows me to nuance my commentary a little bit.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, definitely the social function is one of the driving forces behind the existence of some of the SOEs. That's why they exist and put in place. So definitely will be good to report on that, how these goals are achieved. But in general, SOEs are expected to follow general practices in terms of governance, environmental, social, etc. So, but on that point, definitely it's a very valid point. Thank you very much. So, dear colleagues, yes, please.
Would you mind? I tried to answer to Oksana.
Yeah, please.
And I know Richard is the great experience in terms of SOEs, but I refer to the recent developments of Bulgarian law for SOEs, which is elaborated with the assistance of OECD experts. And in the law is explicitly said that they have to disclose non-financial information. And now, a month ago, in the ordinance for the implementation of this law, there's a special, I would say, norms that refer to ECG for private listed companies. So to make the story short, Bulgarian companies in this law are encouraged to disclose the same information. How they'll try to comply with this, it is a question mark, but at least there is a perspective. And now there is a nomination for new independent directors for the SOEs. And in some of the requirements for there should be independent directors, there are requirements concerning their competence about the ECG, and of course, COVID issue. COVID issue is considered as a social issue concerning disclosure. Sorry for intervening the discussion, but I am, how to say, this is a very hot issue in our company, especially listed. And one more, in one more example, we have a big SOEs. And because this SOEs is listed on the Irish Stock Exchange because they try to accumulate capital from the Irish Stock Exchange, they are disclosing information accordingly. So this is SOEs, a great example that sticks to Bulgarian requirements, but as well, being international issuer, they are complying with the international requirements concerning ECG. Thank you very much for permitting me to share this on-hand information.
Thank you, Bistra. I think it was very useful and helpful information, especially for our Ukrainian colleagues, where the SOE governance is really one of the most important topics at the present. I think we can wrap up this session. Richard, many thanks to you. I think it was a very interesting presentation that provoked many interesting questions, and we had a very interesting discussion. So I know that we are behind time, but definitely, you know, we need to move forward, and we have Jerome who will speak about, you know, strategy, governance, and also about how the information related to target setting and performance, including on ESG factors, how it's important for the investors. So Jerome, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Boris. And hi, everyone. My name is Jerome Levin-Dever. I'm a senior consultant at the AFC. And let me share my screen real quick. So the goal here is to complement what my colleagues Richard and Anne have said, and also previous panels, Roman, in the sense that we'll try to dig deeper a little bit in the, apologies for this, the connection between disclosure and transparency and access to capital. And, you know, we've heard from both Anne and Roman and Richard that there is a big trend towards more and more investors looking for investment opportunities that somehow either promote sustainability or at least manage the downside risks. And the question here, because we are talking to companies, because we are thinking of issuing guidance and regulation for companies to act on that and to try to attract capital, I think the main purpose of my presentation is really to take that perspective of how does a company take advantage in a way of this flow of capital, looking for the type of initiative that you are doing to better your performance on ESG, on sustainable development. And here the difference in perspective is important, that I would say Anne and Richard were explaining to us the perspective from investors, but there is a whole group inside companies that is in charge of corporate finance, that is in charge of sourcing capital to support their initiatives, including those that would contribute to sustainable development, to ESG. And in doing so, we want to also, and the ultimate goal here is to give you a convincing and practical way in which you can use frameworks for transparency and disclosure of sustainability information that is integrated in the company's management and governance. That in of itself is the basis of tapping into that capital. So that's the purpose today. We'll look at trends in sustainable finance that expands the type of products that companies can issue, such that pretty much everyone can participate now. And I think it's a very interesting trend and useful. But also in those trends of sustainable finance products that are emerging, again, showing that it all hinges on the ability of companies to set targets on very key material issues that they are able to measure, monitor, and report to investors. So with that, I will, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to go through it quickly because the main message is pretty simple. But I want to first give you a sense of a few evolution in the market for sustainable finance that points in that direction. One is there's something new that's coming along that's called sustainability-linked finance. And we've heard earlier a lot about green bonds. And green bonds, as it was well explained, is a form of financing where the company identifies very specific assets that, quote unquote, qualify in a taxonomy or otherwise a list of what is considered sustainable. And when these assets are identified, investments in those assets can be the basis for issuing a bond and raising capital. Here we're talking about something quite different, but complementary, where companies are borrowing money through bonds on the capital markets or loans with banks or credit line. And instead of promising to invest those money on specific assets, they instead promise some specific sustainability goals and targets. And oftentimes, well, most of the time, the performance on these targets will dictate the interest rate. And that's been done with bonds, it's been done with loans, and it's been done with credit lines. And it's a really interesting innovation in the market because of a few things. One, it puts emphasis on performance as opposed to the process of investment. And it's really putting companies in front of their own responsibility to improve, not just make promises, but really deliver on targets. Otherwise, the cost of capital goes up. So it's a very convincing mechanism for investors to make investors feel like their capital is going to be well used if it is tied to a sustainability target. It's the ultimate way to ensure performance. And the other reason why this is an important trend is because in the green bond market, some companies in certain industries where it's difficult to identify assets that are sustainable, that fit into the taxonomy of green or sustainable assets, for example, the EU taxonomy, we're not able to access this market. We're not able to raise capital to support their sustainability initiatives, even though they were proud of it, because it didn't fit into the taxonomy. So this provides a more flexibility in the type of companies that can raise capital like that, but also the type of products. And ultimately, what we hear from investors is that in order for large investors to come into this market, they need a lot of diversification they need more investment opportunities in the absolute number, but they also need diversification because that's a rule of modern portfolio management, that you have to invest in diverse range of companies, diverse types of size, diverse industries, etc. The other trend I wanted to talk about real quick is on the green bond front, which we know is growing fast, and there is a lot of movement in the Ukrainian market about green bonds. The green bonds themselves or I should say the user proceed bonds, the the type of bond that is tied into a specific asset has expanded in scope. And now you see green bonds on the model of use of proceed, blue bonds. That's mostly for shipping companies and things associated with ocean, sustainability bonds, social bonds, climate bonds, ocean bonds. There's even one, I think, by Henkel, which is a German chemical company on plastic waste reduction. And what that shows is that the model is expanding, and it's allowing more and more companies to come into the market. I should say, even if they don't specifically fit into a specific taxonomy. And even on the green bond front, even if you stay green, the type of purpose of the funds has increased dramatically, as you can see in the chart here, where many more types of projects from sustainable water to pollution prevention, climate adaptation, green building. You know, there's more and more categories of things that you can put in a green bond that will, quote unquote, qualify as far as the investors are concerned. And that's good news because from a corporate perspective, again, it's not always evident that you're going to have a perfectly green renewable project to finance. Sometimes it's something a little more derivative to that. And then the last trend in sustainable finance products that I wanted to highlight is when companies issue user proceed bonds, whether they are social bonds, green bonds, sustainability bonds, blue bonds, even though the structure of the product is such that it has to be invested in a specific asset, nonetheless, investors expect to understand the performance and the strategy of the overall company. In other words, you're not going to get away from saying, well, my company is not very sustainable, but I've got one project here that's really green and nice. It's a wind farm to, you know, create power from my power plant, or investors will not accept that. They will look beyond, if you want, the isolation of the assets and look to the corporation to make sure that they also are sustainable. And so what you see now is when a company issues a green bond, they also issue a sustainable finance framework, or green finance framework that talks about corporate level strategies and target. And that's kind of becoming a market, an accepted practice in the market, because it's kind of expected from investors. So in other words, you cannot hide anymore behind your green asset. You got to talk about the entire company. And I think this trend towards looking at the process by which a company identifies key material issues, sets targets, measures them, and reports them is also reflected in the growing number of standards for sustainable finance. So, for example, the organization that issues the green bond principles, I would say, based on which most of the green bonds are issued, have also issued sustainability-linked bond principles, which are again, these bonds that are tied to the performance of the company, where the company needs to set targets on key material issues, report on them, and tie the performance of the product, the interest rate on those. And interestingly, the European Central Bank, in addition to accepting green bonds, user proceed bonds as collaterals in their financing, they've recently announced that they will also accept sustainability-linked bonds. And so this is just to show you that the market is moving in a way where obviously there's a lot of capital coming from investors. Traditionally, the complaint has been that there's not enough investment opportunity, but that is changing very quickly. And the way it's changing is completely dependent upon the ability of companies to set targets on key material issues. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it's precisely that. Companies setting targets on key material issues using internal corporate governance mechanism to account for performance and verify the performance, and ultimately reporting on that performance on an ongoing basis. That is the basis on which you can issue some of these products. And that's exactly what the toolkit that IFC has issued and the framework that IFC is proposing on transparency and disclosure is the integration of sustainability in strategy, governance, and performance. And we'll get to that in a second. This is just to illustrate my point. So we were talking about these sustainability-linked bonds. It's a very new phenomenon. We've had sustainability-linked loans for a little bit, but bonds, that's fairly new, and all the transactions listed today here are everything that has been issued on the market, except for two that just recently hit the market. One is a Japanese company, and the other one I don't remember, but this is pretty much happened in 2020. Enel started, it's an Italian utility company. It's the first company to do that. And they did that in September 2019, but then they've issued some follow-up products since then. But the reason why I wanted to show you this is that for each of these transactions, you can see that the companies had to identify key material issues in their sector, find targets that are both achievable, but also credible for the marketplace. In other words, companies can't go to market with something that is not material to them, and they cannot go to market with targets that are not aspirational, so that investors would not feel that this is a material change. And here you can see that the bonds have been, the coupon of the bond has been tied to performance on these very metrics and very material issues. So my last slide, and I'll take a couple of minutes to explain this. By design, I left a lot of text in the slide. This is a graphical representation of our transparency and disclosure framework that is explained in details in the toolkit. It's to show that the toolkit is proposing a method to integrate sustainability at all critical functions of the company, and it kind of functions as a circle because these things repeat every year. But the idea is that in order for a company to communicate effectively through an annual report to stakeholders in a modern way, meaning in a time when investors are not just looking for financial information, but also non-financial information on ESG, you have to start at the beginning. You have to start at the strategic level, where you need to identify material, environmental and social issues, whether they are general or industry specific or specific to the country. And then based on that, investors expect that a company would have some sort of a strategic approach to those issues or opportunities or risks. And from that, in developing a strategy, the ability to develop targets and KPIs to measure progress on that strategy. We then take a long time in the toolkit to explain how the governance structure of the company can be leveraged to monitor and account for performance on this strategy that was set up in the previous phase, including the important step of stakeholder engagement. And lastly, we explain how non-financial performance can be reported alongside financial performance using KPIs, using sustainability statements that are comparable year to year and comparable with other peers. So this is a very quick introduction to the toolkit. Obviously, it's also a call to action to companies in the Ukraine to use this toolkit, and as we continue to work with companies to help them report, this is a great framework. And again, it is a great framework because not only because, but because it enables companies to become qualified for issuing the new types of sustainable finance products that are emerging very quickly in the marketplace. So I know we're pressed for time, and therefore I wanted to keep my presentation short. I hope that this is a good way to kind of wrap up the conversation about all the investor interest and the need for companies to proactively go after this investor base that is looking for impact, and these are the tools to do it. Boris?
Thank you, Jerome. I think it was a very interesting session because lots of new information, I believe, for many of us. And I open the floor for the questions. Dear colleagues, are there questions from your side you would like to ask Jerome? Jerome, maybe I will ask you a question, along with these KPIs, right? Environmental, social governance, ESG KPIs. What other challenge? I mean, this might be, challenging to many of the issues, to have these KPIs in place and monitor the implementation, right? So it's not maybe easy exercise for many companies in this region, especially. But what other challenges, might company face when they look for sustainable investors, right? What could be the most challenging part for the companies?
I do think that it's what we talked about here, the ability to issue a green bond or a sustainability linked bond. Understandably, this is very intimidating a process because you're dealing with capital markets, you're dealing with very sophisticated investors, and they expect that that the KPIs are material, that the numbers are audited or at least verified. And so therefore, this is the end of a process. Just like reporting, having a glossy report that can be confidently shared with the marketplace is an exercise that is the end of a long process that companies need to take great care of doing before they're able to go public. That said, I think you have to start somewhere, and I think that the best place to innovate, I would say, or to try your hand at it or experiment is with the private banking relationship, where the same principles apply. So these are trends that happen on the capital markets, for companies that are traded, but the trend is as true with your banker, and increasingly banks are being pressured by either the central bank of the country or their own providers of capital to make sure that when banks make loan to companies, that they, even if it's not a sustainability linked loan, they want to make sure that they don't loan to companies who are going to violate any of these things. So it starts at the most basic level of financing and relationship with existing investors. So it's not a situation where you will start from 0 to 100, but rather it's a mindset where I think investors are increasingly pressured themselves to be able to understand that and report to their own investors or own constituents. And therefore, anything that the company provides, any attempt to again understand the key material impacts and try to have a strategy around how to deal with that, whether it's a risk or an opportunity, and having some form of target and measurement is a fairly simple concept that companies can start with using the toolkit, using some of the resources that are available or will be available in the country. And with the promotion of the green bond and the infrastructure bond in Ukraine, companies are going to be excited to get into that market, but they will have to quickly get to up to speed on that type of things. Yeah.
Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, very helpful. Dear colleagues, if there are no other questions, we still have one question, and I know that we are short of time, but I think it will not be fair to one of our colleagues if we somehow do not respond to that. And I believe this will be a question to you. And Jerome, once again, many thanks. It was a very interesting session, and we look forward to the next steps of our cooperation in terms of developing, the ESG regulatory framework. And if I may ask that question to you, this question was posed by Viktor Zhubanenko. This was related, in these uncertain times during COVID. How do you think will board totally replace general meeting of shareholders? Thank you.
There have been many regulatory changes under COVID. In fact, for example, we had our annual general meeting. We had it entirely electronically. And there I was with my own little avatar. I had to make sure that that was appropriate for me. And we had some 401 attendees at our annual general meeting. I must say, I would hope the annual general meeting does not get replaced, because there is communication and communication. And when you have to structure the specific questions that come forward, and then there's a pause and there's an answer, it takes away that communication level at the AGM, although you still got it done. I think also when you talk about voting processes, there are very few softwares that actually, we used an Indian software, but there are very few annual general meetings that can allow for the actual online voting as well as the absentee voting. And when you put the two together, you need a particular kind of sophisticated software, and that's another hurdle. I don't think the annual general meeting should be replaced. I think we should. And in fact, that's not the only regulation I hope we're not going to have. We have seen over the course of COVID, many regulators say reduce the prospectus requirements. We as investors would hope we'd go back to the stronger prospectus requirements because it's all been released to get immediate capital into the companies. But I would suggest some of these changes need to change back. And in fact, I know at the OECD, we have a list of activities that are being undertaken for tracking all of the changes that have been made. And myself and others who represent business at the OECD will want to be giving an expression of interest, because there are many changes we want unchanged. We understand the need for them now, but not for the ongoing future. And the AGM is one of those.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very informative answer. Dear all, as we are approaching the end of our webinar, actually we are 1 hour later, but I think it's a good sign at the same time, since we had a very interesting discussion and interesting questions. So I would kindly ask Timur Khromayev. First of all, I would like to thank everybody. First of all, thank our presenters, participants for their input and contribution. And I would like to ask Timur to say a few final words. Timur, please.
Yes, Boris, thank you for the word, and thank you very much for to experts for this wealth of knowledge and experience that we're desperately trying to exploit as much as you give us the opportunity. I've been telling you, and obviously, thank you very much for all of you that you notice our commitment. It's a true commitment. We believe that ESG is fundamental for our markets, regardless of the level of its development, which is very low at the moment, and the crisis, which we understand brings the economic activity down significantly. But ESG is not about the current market cycle. It's about the principles. It's about the values. and values becoming a driving factor for investment decisions. We very much, our fundamental goal here is to develop and build new DNA for Ukrainian financial markets, to get away for asset stripping activity, you know, rentier approach, but go into the more sustainable values and allow more civilized engagements by investors, by the market community with capital. We also don't want to sell the ESG by imposing this, you know, strict regulation, or, you know, making everybody report in particular lines and order and whatnot. But we want to make sure that we build the platform that allows people to exchange information and to make decisions based on this. So the information, and in fact, we also in parallel, and I'm sure many of you know that we're very much engaged in developing operational platforms that allow information processing and exchange of this information, and actually disclosure of this information to the public. We're launching the new XBRL financial statement reporting platform this year. In fact, as I understand, we're the first country in Eastern Europe to do this. So further, based on the methodology of the ESG reporting, we want to make sure that we can bring and develop taxonomy, electronic taxonomy for this information to be properly processed, and the society and the communities can get this information immediately. We consider our access to information as secondary. You know, the information that we need is information that shows, you know, the worst side of investor, you know, behavior. But I think most of it is a good side. So we want that information to be properly processed. So this last mile is what we're mostly interested in and committed in, making sure that it's not only about just information and methodologies that we are getting from you. This is important, but in parallel, we're developing our market and making sure that all of this wealth of knowledge is used immediately. Maybe not with the enormous intensity, but it's useful, and people also capable of using it in a kind of manageable order without overburdening themselves with expenses and costs and whatnot. So thank you very much. Very much happy with the discussions, and thank you all of you for spending so much time with us.
Timur,
thank you.
Timur, thanks so much. It's great pleasure to work with you, and personally with you and your colleagues. We are really glad to have such a committed partner as National Securities and Stock Market Commission, and we look forward to the next steps of our cooperation. From my side, I can say that our program will continue working with you on development of ESG regulatory framework. We have this supplement to the corporate governance code, also ESG scorecard to monitor its implementations of the CG code and make it more effective, and also ESG disclosure guidelines. I think this to some extent will also answer questions which we had from some of our participants. And also I would like to mention that our program, ESG advisory program, it also is open for opportunities to work with individual companies. So we can work in different directions, including ESG as a governance for sustainability assessment. We can work on subject-specific matters such as ESG disclosure, helping to draft respective policies in terms of ESG information disclosure, different focus workshops, etc., etc. So please let us know if there are any questions. This is particular to our participants. If you would like to have advice in terms of ESG advisory, we will be very glad to be in touch with you and provide our support. Once again, I would like to thank to express my gratitude to the Commission for their very effective collaboration, and also to SECO for their continued support. And last but not least, please join me in thanking our interpreters. They had a very hard day. It was not easy day. It's a long discussion, but they did a great job. So with that in mind, I would like to thank everybody and close this session. Thank you very much. And I wish you a nice weekend to all of you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye to all. Nice weekend.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Yes,
You too.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, Mr. Thank you.